Camelot served for the stage of reunion, between parents freshly baptized in the eldritch truth, with their lost and miraculous child plus one venerable marmalade tomcat, of course, playing the fool around everybody's ankles to keep us sober and sensible. But the whole process turned out more awkward than tearful. It was nothing like in the movies, where everybody would cry out each other's names and fly into each other's arms, weeping buckets of tears and declaring they'll never let go again and so on and so forth. The reality of such defining moments is always less cinematic than in our imaginations, always more messy, less clean-cut, never really final, lacking any of that sweeping conclusion that real stories so often possess. In reality, or in this case outside the dramatic moment passes, life goes on, and one simply has to live with the consequences. Don't get me wrong, Stephen and Isabella were obviously and openly overwhelmed with emotion. They did love their daughter. Her return and safety was a blessing. They were thankful in a way they couldn't fully express. But watching them go through the relief and vulnerability made me feel like a voyeur on a private moment, a predator on their emotions, an intruder on their most tender and unstable feelings. Like I shouldn't be witnessing it. Even if I had saved Natalie and opened her parents' eyes, I was truly an outsider to this trio. And a hissing, bitter voice in my chest insisted that they didn't deserve this relief. Luckily for a given value of luck, I was also rather distracted by the important yet unrelated discovery that Lozzie's Knights had embarked on a construction project. Our arrival in Camelot was considerably less graceful and controlled than my slip to the Shamble Swamp. With no further need to maintain the illusion that I was some kind of terrifying outsider godling avatar, here to strike the fear of hell into Natalie's parents, I didn't have to maintain my footing when we touched down. Which was nice, because I was absolutely exhausted by then. Back in England it must have been past 3 o'clock in the morning, or close to that, and I'd had one of the busiest days of my life, not to mention that I'd performed half a dozen slips since mid-afternoon. Or was it more? Had I done 7 slips that day? I couldn't recall exactly, which was testimony to how tired I felt. In theory my abdominal bioreactor could keep me on my feet indefinitely, such was the fruit of abyssal biohacking, but it couldn't keep me from feeling like a zombie. My brain was mush, my muscles were cracked leather, and my eyes were dry sockets filled with salt. So, when Camelot blossomed around us in soft yellow grass on rolling hillsides, the omnipresent purple glow of the whorled skies, and the glint of light on the star-steel armor of Lozzie's Knights, I let go of my charges with arm and tentacle, and sat down very heavily on my backside. Jeanne kept her feet of course, only swaying a little, grunting deep down in her chest like a tiger with an upset tummy. Sevens was totally unaffected by the slip, cheating as usual. I suspected Sevens never actually went along with the slip process, neither with me or with Lozzie, but only pretended to while she used her own far less traumatic way of sliding through the membrane between worlds. Stephen and Isabella were afforded no such mercies, however. While I groaned and hunched up and held on tight to the contents of my stomach, fighting off a stabbing headache like a hot poker through both my eyeballs, Natalie's parents went sprawling again. At least Camelot's grassy hillsides made a better cushion than a rocky outcrop in the Shamble Swamp. No skinned hands this time. My fifth and final passenger didn't care about headaches or vomiting, or the soul violence of the slip, or the subtle, creeping wrongness of outside, even here in safe, familiar Camelot. But neither could he enjoy the warm, cinnamon-scented wind which trickled through the air from parts unknown, or the transcendent spectacle of the sky filled with those purple whirls like shreds of quartz galaxy lying in low orbit, or the fairy-tale figures of Lozzie's Knights in their impossibly perfect armor. The corpse of the young man who the Shambler had refused to eat, he couldn't care about anything anymore. Camelot was going to be his resting place. Another concession to Evelyn's paranoia, but even I had to admit this was a sensible precaution. We couldn't risk bringing the unidentified corpse back to our reality and burying him in secret, no matter how much he deserved the basic dignity and respect of repatriation. He might be found, wherever we buried him. Police might launch an investigation, might trace the body back to us. So he would be buried here, in a beautiful and peaceful place he had never and would never see. As I recovered from the pain of brain math, curled up and groaning like I had indigestion, I gratefully let go of the withered, dried-out corpse with the one tentacle I had wrapped around the dead man's shoulders. But I cradled the skull with care, making sure he was lying flat on the grassy hilltop, not dropped like a sack of potatoes. Stephen and Isabella took a long time to pull themselves together. 2 slips in close succession was a lot to ask from uninitiated human beings. Stephen spat bile into the grass, then collapsed, then managed to roll onto his back, gazing up in awe at the purple-whorled sky. "Is this outside too?" he asked in a croaking voice. Yes," I grunted into my own knees, still fighting off the stabbing headache. "Different dimension. Safe place. We call it Camelot." Stephen spluttered a very weak laugh. "Camelot? Don't ask." "Fair enough." Isabella tried very hard not to sob at the pain and disorientation as she shivered on her hands and knees. She almost found victory, but then Stephen gently took her wrist, and she lost herself to a wave of nausea and tears. The bitter whisperer deep in my chest didn't approve of that. It wanted me to growl and hiss at this pair of entitled apes, tell them they were lucky they hadn't ended up like the dead man we were going to bury here. It wanted to remind them that without me and my powers and experience, their daughter would be rotting in the swamp as well. "Why does your little girl get to live while this man died of exposure and thirst? Your relief comes at the price of an innocent life. We don't even know his name." That twisted, bitter part of me, coiled in my chest like a rotten grub. It had so little sympathy or trust for Natalie's parents but infinite empathy and care for this nameless dead man. As they lay there, panting and quivering on the grass of Camelot, I felt a vindictive urge to ask them a hypothetical question. Would one of you swap places with this man? Would you give yourself up for the sake of your daughter? In a way, I'd already asked them that, just before we'd left the swamp. And they'd both answered in the positive. Yes, they were in. They were on their daughter's side. "They'll drift away as soon as you leave." But I had to believe they would keep faith even if I was going to have to keep an eye on them for a while. "Shaman," Jing purred. She reached down to cup the back of my head with one hand. Her voice contained an oddly worried note. "Fine," I grunted, my eyes still squeezed shut against the pain. Seven's yellow cloak was doing a good job of providing warmth and comfort, even through my hoodie. I tugged it tighter around myself. "'S just brain math stuff. You've seen this a million times." "Sevens, are you here too?" "Sevens." Sevens took a moment to answer. "Yes." "Slazzy here." I finally raised my head and rubbed at my eyes with a tentacle, feeling bleary and bloodshot. "We need to make sure Nat doesn't see the corpse again. Or see her parents hurting, or. I trailed off in shock, eyes going wide, overwhelmed by a kind of awe I had not felt myself in many months. Stephen was sitting up, staring as well, though he wasn't shocked in the same kind of way. After all, this was the first time he and Isabella had seen Camelot. All of this was out of the ordinary to them, from the purple sky to the nights and the gargantuan semi-machine presence of Lazzie's caterpillars, and... "Do you call it Camelot because of the castle?" he asked. I answered with a hiccup. In our absence, the nights of the perhaps not so metaphorical anymore round table had apparently been very busy indeed. We had materialized in the middle of a construction site, albeit a very quiet one, which enclosed the nearby rolling hillsides. My usual arrival spot in Camelot happened to be situated on a slightly higher hillside, by chance or luck or more likely, by the unspoken, hidden, theatrical flair of the nights themselves. That hilltop just so happened to form the perfect vantage point to look out across their handiwork. I shook my head in awe, eyes wide, twisting where I sat to take it all in. To be fair to poor Stephen, he was exaggerating, but only because the structure was clearly unfinished. If this was to be a castle, then it had a long way to go yet, and I should know, because I know castles. At least, from books. The knights, along with their larger group-mind allies in the caterpillars, had begun building 2 distinct structures. The outline of a future curtain wall ran along the nearby hillsides, claiming the highest points and joining them together with what I assumed would eventually be tall stretches of stonework. For now, the curtain wall was only a dream, carved into the landscape with a ditch ready for the foundation blocks, but some of those blocks were in place, monolithic slabs of sandstone-colored rock laid level and flat in the ground, waiting for mortar and stone to be placed atop them. Along that ring of future wall, I spied 3 low areas without any ditch cut into the soil, obviously intended to become gatehouses. They were wide enough for 2 caterpillars abreast. Completely indefensible, I murmured to myself, but I was just talking nonsense, too numb to think. This wasn't medieval Europe, they weren't going to be defending their fortress against cannons and scaling ladders. What were they planning to defend against? Off to our left lay the area of relatively flat ground where the friendly caterpillar had once stood to provide us with a stable, upright surface for the gateway exit point, along with the piece of shed carapace that he had so graciously gifted us as a bench, on which to sit and watch Sheng and Rain having a duel out on the grassy steppe. The caterpillar had since moved on, leaving behind a large area of dead grass, gone brown without the sustenance of the strange purple light from the sunless sky. But the bench remained, as did the gateway exit. The caterpillar had obviously shed another plate of organic carapace armor, the plate on which the gateway had stood. The knights had mounted that plate upright, braced either side with more of that strange, dusky stone, and created a square of stone tiles around the gateway. A welcome mat, for visitors from Earth. It was only in the very early stages of the process, with foundation stones laid down in a massive rectangular shape, made of that same odd, dusky sandstone-like rock. But where the curtain wall was only a suggestion waiting to be filled in, the keep was well underway, with low walls taking shape and sweeping arches for the entrances and a wide area of paved ground marking out the surroundings. The massive blocks of stone had been cut into more manageable bricks, held together with a faintly pinkish mortar. Almost one entire floor looked ready, and a second was creeping upward. I even spied what looked like narrow windows, arrow-slit style. Not all of it was made from that odd stone. Some parts, the arches, the windows, anything that required complex shapes were formed from pieces of caterpillar carapace, cut or bent or molded into the right forms. A castle taking form, in stone and bone. They even had a crane and pulley system, also built from pieces of caterpillar carapace, though I had no idea what they were using for rope. No wood, of course, I murmured. What are the internal floors made from? The whole structure was swarming with knights, all of them working in silence except for the occasional clack of stone on stone. Many of them were carrying small sandstone blocks in carriers made from pieces of caterpillar carapace, others were mixing what looked like some kind of mortar in a great white cauldron, drooling long strands of organic material from within intentional openings in their amour into the mixture. Many knights were working on cutting massive stone blocks into smaller bricks, using tools that looked repurposed from their weapons. Further knights were sitting and standing around as if observing or overseeing the building work. Some of them still carried their weapons in their gauntlets, but most of them had their hands free for spades or poles or mixing tools. Several caterpillars were lined up inside the walls as well, 3 of them, massive whale-sized things that dwarfed the knights. One of them was dotted with little growing structures, strange twists and turns of carapace, growing the pieces needed for the castle. The other 2 were carrying massive blocks of that dusky sandstone on their backs, roped to them with thick strands of sticky-looking black tar that were probably as wide around as a human being. The knights scurried about them, helping to lower the stone next to the masonry workshop area. In the distance to our right, I could see several more caterpillars on the horizon, tiny white lozenge shapes either moving toward the castle or away from it. Some of them also had stone secured to their backs, visible even at such great distance if one squinted a bit. Went Sevens. Or is it because of the blokes in armor? Stephen asked when I didn't answer. I tried to gather my thoughts. It's because of the knights, yes. Stephen and Isabella must have heard the worry and confusion in my voice, because they shared a sudden, twitchy, nervous glance. Isabella had managed to get to her feet, but her husband was still sitting on the grass like me. Even if I was no longer a prospective god in their minds, I was still the person in charge. I was the one who knew what was going on, so hearing me awestruck was probably not a good sign for their own survival or for the safety of their daughter. "Ha," Jing grunted. Performatively unimpressed, but she wasn't fooling me. It's fine," I said, then couldn't resist a deep sigh. I could feel a headache coming on. My squid skull mask called to me, promising to soothe the pain if I slipped it on over my head. But I needed a human face right then. We were still treading delicate ground. "I'm just surprised, this is new, it's..." Sevens cleared her throat delicately. The Knightly Order of Camelot did not obtain planning permission for this new build. Stephen blinked hard, once, then nodded seriously. "Oh, right. Right then." Sevens had successfully summed up the problem in terms he could understand all too well. Isabella looked less convinced, frowning to herself as she stared at the castle. Her long-fingered hands wrung together in barely contained anxiety. She looked like a stripped willow tree, lost outside on some forgotten hill. "Who do you ask for planning permission, out here? Is there a county council?" She winced. "No, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, that's absurd, obviously, sorry." "Me," I grunted, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Or Lozzie? I don't know." Seven stepped forward, using her umbrella as a casual walking stick. "There is nothing to fear. This castle belongs to Heather, undoubtedly." "I don't want another castle," I grumbled. "What are they doing? Another?" Isabella blinked at me, eyes wide. Stephen was frowning up at Sevens now. "If you don't mind me asking, miss, who are you? You kind of appeared out of nowhere, He eyed Jing as well, realizing that he had no idea who or what she was either. He was still very lost, desperate to get his little girl back, navigating mysterious waters. "I'm an actual god," said Sevens, cold and completely straight-faced. "But not the kind you worship. Don't think about it too hard." I gave Sevens such a look. She politely tilted her head at me, the picture of innocence. "You and I are going to have a talk later," I said. "Are we?" I sighed and stuck out one hand to Zheng. "Help me up, please. I'm too tired to expend effort." "Please." Zheng hauled me to my feet, though she probably didn't need to. I could have climbed her side with my tentacles all by myself, though I still clung to her arm for support once I was standing, huddling inside the skin warmth of the yellow cloak. For a moment I just gazed out across the castle works, at the knights all busy building, at the caterpillars serving as heavy lifting gear and extruding pieces of castle structure, wondering what on earth was going on. How have they done this in a single week? I asked nobody in particular. I was last here a week ago. Okay, well, maybe a bit more than a week, but still. How large is this going to be? Sevens ventured a suggestion. Arundel-sized. The Bailey is easily large enough. No Norman motte in the middle, of course. The keep will be very different, square and more modern. I scoffed with humorless laughter. I've been to Arundel Castle, it's huge, its weight. I frowned at her, though 7 shades of suspiciously specific experience was gazing out at the castle too, seemingly very interested. Sevens, how do you know Arundel Castle? I visited for a siege. Only for one day, though. The rest of it wasn't relevant to me. By then, Stephen had gotten to his feet as well, with his wife's assistance. Even in my increasingly exasperated state, I couldn't help but notice they remained holding hands with each other, unwilling to let go as they stared out in awe at the seat of a castle framed against the whirled purple sky of Camelot. For a moment they didn't seem like older adults at all, but more like a pair of teenagers who'd been playing at maturity, suddenly confronted by the vast and inhuman depths of the cosmos. Not so different to me, see? I told that bitter snake coiled in my chest, but the voice responded with only a derisive snort. Zheng rumbled, like a cat's trill but on a tiger's scale. Shaman, I do not see the mooncalf. Well, yes, I huffed. She's probably behind the bloody great castle, or capering about on the far side of one of the caterpillars, or I don't know, supervising engravings of catgirls on the inside of a great hall while it's still under construction. Very suitable, said Sevens. My final burst of irritation was half a hasty performance. I swallowed hard but tried to conceal the sudden draining of blood from my head and limbs, the plummeting feeling in my gut, and the cold sweat breaking out down my back. If Lozzie wasn't here, something must have gone badly wrong. Her part of the plan had involved at least one more slip, with Natalie and Termy and Tenny in tow. But she should have been here over an hour ago. She should have been waiting for us. A terrible possibility blossomed in my imagination. What if Edward had a second machine all along? What if we were still standing waist deep in his trap? Shaman. Zheng rumbled. Hiding my sudden anxiety from her was impossible. She could probably smell my fear. We should look for Lozzie. She's probably in the castle. Seven Shades of sauntering to the rescue raised her umbrella and pointed with the metal tip. I spy Termy right there. Lozzie must be close. Termy. I must have squeaked like a surprised fox, because Stephen and Isabella both flinched and stared at me, before they also looked toward their lost cat. Sevens was right. There was Termy, a marmalade blob smudge visible against the velvety yellow grass. He was about halfway across the enclosure of the prospective curtain walls, just by the edge of the keep, nosing and sniffing at the metal gauntlet a knight had extended toward him. 3 knights in total had assumed a crouched position around the cat, each with one hand out, waiting for Termy to sniff, or perhaps submit to petting. I hadn't noticed him there between the trio of crouching knights, because I'd assumed they were working on something at the base of the wall. Termy didn't seem to have noticed us either, especially once he started rubbing himself on one of the knight's hands. The relief was overwhelming, and not just for Natalie's parents. Isabella put a hand to her chest. Stephen let out a shuddering sigh. But I felt all my fears crawl back up into my brain stem and leave only irritation in their wake. If Termy was here, then Lozzie was here too, and she really was messing around in a half-finished castle, a construction site, with a small child. 2 children, if one counted Tenny. Such a popular fellow, isn't he? Sevens was saying. I heard a tiny sigh in her voice. Her free hand unconsciously brushed at her skirt, trying to brush away the memory of Termy's shed fur. Oh, I hissed. I can't believe how irresponsible Lozzie can be. Really. I huffed harder, gathering myself. I don't have the energy to worry right now, about this unlicensed crenellation. I simply do not. My angry snap finally drew the attention of some of the nearby knights. Visorless sealed faceplates turned toward us. Working knights stopped in their ceaseless motion and looked up from carrying bricks or mixing mortar or cutting stone. The knights working the crane paused their limbs like automatons and turned only their heads. The attention went through them like a wave, until every single knight was stock still and staring in our direction. Went Stephen. Isabella's lips were shaking, too, eyes gone wide. Sometimes it was all too easy for me to forget how eerie the nights could be. I'd grown too used to them. Yes, hello. I called out. Yes, it's me, hi. Don't blame me for being a bit surprised, now, you're all. Bwop. Bwip. Bop. We all flinched together. Well, Sevens didn't, though even Zheng stiffened briefly, head snapping around at the trio of sudden booming noises that echoed out across the quiet plain. None of the knights reacted, of course, but over by the keep I saw Termy jump and hiss, arching his back and fluffing up his tail at this unseen sonic assault. It's fine. I called out, heart racing, one hand pressed to my chest, tentacles instinctively flared outward. It's just the caterpillars, the giant white things over there. They were just saying hello. The caterpillar's giant engine booms were of course only miniature versions of the deafening alarm roar any of them could make if they so chose to. Even now, as we recovered our breath and nursed racing pulses, I could hear a trio of great engines dialing down, a chorus of bass machinery inside the caterpillar's pitted white carapaces, returning to standby. However, I did raise one tentacle to wave a greeting. The last thing I wanted was the great machine creatures to think we hadn't heard, and express themselves again but louder. Zheng followed suit, oddly enough, raising a single closed fist in salute. Isabella and Stephen looked more than a bit shell-shocked at all this. Their baptism of fire in the shamble swamp had been up close and personal, something I hadn't let them look away from, but at least it had all been mostly on the human scale. The caterpillar speaking, things on that scale communicating, was still a bit too much for them. But I didn't tell them to look away. The more they saw, the more they were forced to integrate into their worldview. That's why Camelot had come second. Safe, secure, peaceful Camelot. I just hadn't expected the castle. As we waved to our gigantic machine grub friends, a tiny blonde head popped up over the lip of the incomplete walls of the castle keep. A puff of blonde hair, a flap of pentacolor pastel poncho, and Lozzie vanished again into the bowels of the construction site. All over the rest of the castle grounds, the knights turned their heads away from us, resumed working on their various tasks, and got back on with the business of building. I shook my head and put my hands on my hips, tooting softly. A moment later, 3 small figures appeared around the far side of the castle, flanked by a pair of knights on guard duty. Lozzie diligently took the lead as Tenny herded little Natalie along, holding both of Natalie's hands with her silken black tentacles. Nat! Isabella almost sobbed. Stephen looked about ready to cry too. Come along, I said, stepping forward and dragging Zheng after me. Let's go meet them. I'd rather Natalie not have to see the corpse all over again. We set off across the yellow grass, across what would one day be a castle courtyard. I glanced back only once, at the sad and lonely body of the nameless young man. Natalie was reunited with her parents beneath the shelter of the walls of Camelot's keep. We met her and Lozzie and Tenny just shy of the border of paved ground the knights had laid out. The pair of knights accompanying them stopped a little way behind. When little Natalie realized that the octopus lady had brought her back to her parents at last, she pulled free of Tenny's embrace and ran across the gap which separated them, babbling for Mummy and Daddy. Her parents did something not too dissimilar. I did my best to look away. The actual moment of reunion between parents and child was deeply embarrassing to witness, but also a potential minefield. We couldn't simply turn away and allow it to play out until the moment of emotional exhaustion. We couldn't give this family their privacy, not yet because Tenny was right there and Nat had taken a liking to her. She'd made friends with a humanoid moth puppy. Mom and Dad were going to have questions. Which was, of course, at least partly intentional. It didn't take too long for the tears to subside, though Natalie didn't cry at all. She had that far-past exhaustion look that very tired small children sometimes get, wired with manic energy from hidden reserves, dressed in borrowed pajamas and a pair of Crocs from Evie which were far too large for her small feet. She kicked them off as her mother lifted her up for a hug, and didn't bother to slip them back on after she was placed back down again. She scrunched bare feet against the grass of Camelot, uncaring of how it felt, as her parents fussed over her. That was the first sign which worried me. And then the octopus lady made it go away, but it's not bad, it's just like a big confused dog, a bad dog, but not because it's a bad dog but. Natalie babbled on with a small child's explanation of what had happened, even as her mother would barely let go of her, and her father cried quiet tears of relief. But Tens is really nice, and Tens made it go away again by getting really big and. Eventually, once they'd reassured their brainstems that their daughter was safe and sound and interrupted her several times to ask if she was hurt anywhere, Isabella and Stephen managed to spare a sliver of attention to realize what exactly their daughter was gesturing toward so happily. Isabella kept a firm grip on one of Natalie's hands. Stephen straightened up and stared. Bert, went Tenny, tilting her head at the parents. Two of her black tentacles were idly reaching toward her new friend. Another two were edging toward each of the parents, as if curious about them but not quite sure. Nayot. Isabella and Stephen were freshly terrified all over again. What did they see when they looked at Tenny? Fluffy white fur on coal-black skin, a pair of twitching antennae on her head, and eyes like something dredged from the deep. Tenny's musculature was almost human, but not quite, like her muscles and joints were linked incorrectly to be a truly human frame. Wings hanging down like a cloak, part of her body, and a great mass of tentacles writhing out from the hidden space between wings and shoulders. To me and to Lozzie, Tenny was beautiful. But to people who had not encountered her before, this thing had just said their child's name. Their body language was defensive, ready to flee or fight. Tenny must have seen it too, because all her tentacles paused, a worried look on her face, a touch of caution in those wide black eyes. Tenny. Natalie reached out a hand, inviting the tentacle to hold again. Lozzie waved the corner of her poncho at the parents. Hi. I cleared my throat and stepped forward. The time for polite distance was over. Allow me, please. I gestured at Lozzie first, trying to ease them into yet more supernatural truths. This is Lozzie, my sister. I settled on that word without really thinking about it, but it somehow felt right. Lozzie flashed a cheeky, delighted look at me. Without her, your daughter would have been taken away again. Then I gestured at Tenny. This is Tenny, Lozzie's daughter. Subjectively, she's about the same age as Natalie. An irritated trill interrupted me. Older, said Tenny. I'm older, Heath. To my great and lasting relief, Natalie let out a giggle. That probably did more work than anything I could say. With the doubtful caution of a pair of apes letting a serpent into their den, Natalie's parents watched as one of Tenny's tentacles returned to hold Natalie's hand. I sighed and forced a smile. Yes, well, Tenny is also a child, just a bit older, subjectively speaking. She's been helping to look after Natalie since we found her in the swamp. Tenny's a friend, Natalie said, full of sudden bursting enthusiasm, looking up at her mother and father. And she's really, really clever. She does clever things with all her octopus parts, lots of different things at once. Stephen and Isabella did not look quite convinced just yet. The undeniable physical reality of Tenny had pushed both of them back up to the border of their own sanity. Isabella had gone white in the face, in shock or horror, while Stephen looked like he wanted to spit with disgust. I hoped he wouldn't, for Tenny's sake. The idea that their child had been kidnapped by an evil wizard and spirited away beyond the walls of reality, that was one thing. They could maybe deal with that concept because she was now being saved, returned to normality by the powers of things beyond their comprehension. But the prospect of Natalie making friends with something visibly alien and other? That was a different hurdle. But they had to leap it. I wouldn't let them refuse the change. How could they not reject this? Whispered the doubtful voice. Belief doesn't equal acceptance. You're all monsters to them, these so-called normal people. To my horror, I agreed with the doubts, even if they did sound a little edgy when put into words. Lozzie and I both waited with bated breath, to see what was going to happen. Despite appearances, we weren't actually putting Tenny on the spot without any support. Tenny, bless her speed of comprehension, had been given a set of very clear and explicit instructions, plus reassurances, by both myself and Lozzie, before we'd put the beginning of the plan into action. The situation was not about to spiral out of control. Even if something unexpected happened, Tenny was still anchored, both physically and emotionally. Nobody had remarked on the single black tentacle that had crept out from beneath her wings and slid up inside Lozzie's poncho. Tenny was holding her mother's hand. She knew we were here. Hello. Hello. Tenny trilled, like some kind of exotic jungle parrot repeating the first word she'd heard. But it didn't earn her a reply from Natalie's parents. I cleared my throat and stuck to the script. Tenny, Stephen and Isabella are Natalie's parents. What do you say to a friend's parents? Oh. Tenny trilled at me, big black eyes going wide. She didn't actually need reminding that the surprise was part of the act. She turned back to Natalie's parents and nodded her head in a little bow. Thank you, she trilled in her fluttering voice, from a vocal system that we couldn't even picture. Thank you for letting me play with Nat, Mr. and Mrs. Brrt. Tenny trailed off and glanced to me for help. She was, after all, a nervous young teenager talking to a pair of unfamiliar adults. Mr. and Mrs. Skeets, I supplied in a stage whisper. Skeets. Tenny announced like she'd flipped over a rock and found a fascinating bug. Half a dozen black, silken tentacles wiggled in a halo around her body, bobbing and weaving with the release of nervous energy. Tenny beamed. Stephen Skeets swallowed hard and glanced at me for guidance or reassurance. The moment you're gone, they'll revert to disgust, whispered the horrible hissing in my chest. Tenny is not a human being, I said out loud, struggling not to hiccup. I'd practiced these lines, but they still came hard. But she is a person, sapient like us. She's from Earth, not outside, whatever she looks like. And she's also a little girl. Brrt. Went Tenny, fluttering with irritation. She flapped her arms. Several tentacles waggled and wobbled at me. Not little. Heath. Natalie giggled in delight. Tenny wasn't frightening to her, not at all. Lozzie spread her arms beneath her poncho, catching everyone's attention for a moment with the display of pentacolor pastel, like a songbird flaring her crest. She's my precious babby, said Lozzie. So be kind, please. For just a second, Lozzie held Isabella's wary gaze, those little elfin eyes sparkling with mischief and knowledge. Then she did this sort of bend from the waist, flopping forward and letting her poncho flap with her, all relaxed and loose, before whirling back up and fixing Stephen with the same look. I had no idea if Lozzie was performing covert magic based on interpretive dance, or if she was just being her usual silly self, but whatever it was, it worked. Isabella and Stephen both visibly relaxed, if only by a very small fraction, and the eyes they turned toward Tenny were now consciously restrained and polite. Parenthood bridged the gap. I still struggled to think of Lozzie as Tenny's mum, but she was, in a very real way. Tenny, was it? Isabella managed to say. You're very welcome. And thank you too, for keeping Nat company. Isabella looked to me again for confirmation. I nodded, while Tenny happily wiggled her tentacles. Mom. Mom. Natalie was saying, tugging on her mother's hand. Tenny can tie knots with her tentacles, it's really funny. And we found a really huge round table inside the castle. And one of the caterpillars said hello to me. And Natalie was not acting much like a child who had just returned from a traumatic experience, she was rattling on at her parents like she'd just gotten home from a school trip. On one hand, that was a good sign. She wasn't clinging to Mummy and Daddy in wild-eyed terror, which would present well for the story that the Skeets would have to tell the police. But she was almost too normal, too excited, too stable. I didn't mention that out loud, of course. I stepped back, politely giving the little family the space they needed. Stephen made eye contact with me as I withdrew a few paces, so I said, "We'll take you straight back home in a few minutes, when you're ready. We'll need to talk about practical matters, but it might be better to do that around a kitchen table, rather than out here. Let Nat stretch her legs for a few minutes." Stephen nodded. Natalie bobbed on her bare feet and said, "Thank you, octopus lady." Isabella looked at me too. "Thank you," she said, deadly serious. The awkward moment collapsed in two mutually acceptable directions. Natalie, chattering with childlike excitement, started to lead her parents off around the side of the castle, to show them the part of the wall where it gets really tall, that knight with the funny helmet, and presumably to find Termy before we left. Tenny trailed along with them, still holding Natalie's other hand in one curled end of a tentacle. Seven stepped past me to provide a safe chaperone, flourishing her umbrella like a fancy walking stick, just in case of a blow-up or something unexpected happening. We hadn't planned this part, but she sauntered on without asking for guidance. Which was a relief. Perhaps she was trying to make up for earlier. "I will watch the puppy, too," Zheng rumbled, but she only detached herself from my side after I acknowledged with a nod. I had regained enough strength to stand on my own 2 feet without wavering. 2 feet and 2 tentacles as extra bracing against the ground. I had also mustered enough strength of mind to reach out with one tentacle and snag the hem of Lassie's poncho, just as she was about to skip off to join the rear of the impromptu tour group. "Hey," I croaked. Lassie did a little flutterflounce turn, dipping her head to one side. "Heathy. Let them walk around for a few minutes," I said. Lassie bit her bottom lip, openly doubtful and casting a look at the backs of the others as they neared the corner of the unfinished castle keep. I added, "Tenny has a princess of Carcosa and Zheng to look after her, she'll be fine." Lassie leaned toward me, wiggled her eyebrows, and put one hand next to her mouth in a comedic stage whisper pose. I was thinking more about Mr. and Mrs. Gloomy Face. I think they need a breather too. And they've got sevens, if things go off the rails. "Please, Lassie. Come with me instead. I need to take a look at the body, and I'd rather not do it alone. And I want your opinion on something." Lassie blinked several times as if surprised, went through a very brief show of resistance, pursing her lips and putting her hands on her hips, then broke into a sunburst of a smile, flapped the sides of her poncho, and skipped over to my side to take me by the hand. While Natalie and her parents wandered the grounds of Camelot under construction, Lassie and I retraced our earlier steps, heading up the gentle slope to where I'd left the corpse of the unknown traveler. He wasn't alone anymore. 3 knights had appeared around the corpse. One stood at his head and another by his feet, both holding halberd-like weapons, facing outward toward the castle keep. A third stood opposite us, on the far side of the corpse, with a familiar long-hafted axe held in both hands, as if at parade attention. I would recognize my friend anywhere. It was the Forest Knight. Taken together, framed against the purple whirls in Camelot's sky, the 3 of them looked like the protagonists of an Arthurian legend, gazing off into their destiny. Or a very cheap fantasy novel cover by an artist who disliked drawing faces. Lassie and I took it slow as we climbed the hill, to give us time to talk. "Lassie," I murmured, peering ahead at the knights around the corpse. "What are they doing?" "Standing vigil," she replied instantly, her voice a sad trickle of its usual self. "Lassie. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. I know you don't like this kind of thing, I just needed a friend with me, I need to drop the act." Lassie sniffed and wiped her eyes on a corner of her poncho, then turned a bright smile on me again. "It's okay. They're just so sweet is all, they're such good sweeties and boys and girls and all other sorts, did you know that too? They've invented all these ones that they have terms for but no words yet. They don't do words often. We should teach them that too. More words." I sighed, but with a smile on my face. "I think we've taught them plenty, already. Lassie, what are they doing here?" I glanced over my shoulder at the medieval construction site sprawled out behind us. "I mean, not just up on this hill. The whole thing. Why are they building a castle? More importantly, who are they hoping to defend against? I thought you said this world was empty, nothing here, all long extinct." Lassie shrugged, tilting her head at me, rather puffaced. "I think they just think it's cool. I'm sorry, it's cool. You love castles too, don't you?" "Well, yes, I do, but..." Lassie snorted and waved me down as if I was being silly. "Where do you think they got the idea?" She extended one arm out and pointed at the Forest Knight. "You gave him all sorts of stuff from inside you, didn't you?" I blinked in realization. Of course, when the forest knight had almost died from spiritual decompression, and I'd had to inject him with the product of my own distilled and purified abyssal energies, I'd shared something with him that was never meant to be a physical substance, let alone leave my own flesh, and I had briefly joined the very edge of the round table, though the communication had all happened in a medium I hadn't the faintest notion of how to understand. And now the knights were building a castle, because it was cool. I hope they're not going to adopt any other tastes and interests from my subconscious, I said, pulling a little grimace. Lozzie giggled and flapped her poncho. Well, I'm glad you find it amusing, but we can't have them all developing a crush on Zheng. Lozzie snorted again. Heathy. What? You're telling me that's not possible? They picked up a love of castles, so why not that? Because they're knights. It makes sense for them to build a castle. I tooted and shook my head, blushing faintly and frowning in utter perplexity. All this activity, this building, this industry, this was my fault all along. I couldn't adjust to that idea. Where are they even getting those huge stone blocks? I asked. Are the caddies okay, hauling them all that distance? They're fine. And where are they getting it from? Lozzie pointed toward the distant horizon, where several tiny white specks were visible, the caterpillars on their long trek to whatever makeshift quarry they'd carved out of some rocky ground, untouched and unseen by mortal eyes for thousands of years. There was a vague shape on the horizon when one squinted in that direction, the faintest suggestion of naked stone, dun and dusty. There's an abandoned city that way. They're taking from there. I stopped dead and turned my head to stare at Lozzie. She tilted her own head back and forth, like a confused puppy. Heathy. Lozzie. Heathy. You're telling me that this castle is being built with pieces of monolithic stone stolen from a dead, ancient city, on a dead world? Yeah. I blinked several times, rubbed the bridge of my nose, and decided it didn't matter. I suppose the knights didn't adopt a healthy fear of curses, then. Lozzie mock gasped and flapped one hand beneath her poncho. Heathy, you believe in curses? I gave her a scathing look. Can you blame me, really? Lozzie found that irresistibly funny. She giggled all the way up the rest of the hill, all the way to the feet of the knights, windmilling one arm and tugging on my hand, calling me the cutest silly button. She only trailed off when we came face to face with the corpse and the knights standing over him in their honor guard, for a dead man they didn't even know. Hello you, I said to the forest knight. His helmet dipped by a fraction of an inch. No, I understand, you can't move right now. You're standing vigil. Thank you for doing this. You really didn't have to, any of you three. I looked at the other two knights, but they stayed stock still. The forest knight resumed his position, helmet up, gazing out across the landscape. Lozzie was biting her lower lip, staring down at the corpse, at the mummified, grayish skin on the man's face and forearms. Hey, I said softly, squeezing her hand and tugging gently so she would turn away. Don't look just yet. Let's think about something else. So we did. For a long, quiet, peaceful moment, Lozzie and I stood hand in hand on the hilltop, gazing out across the castle construction site. Lozzie wriggled inside her poncho. I watched the little figures trailing around the edge of the keep, Natalie leading her parents and Tenny, followed by Zheng and Sevens. A familiar orange blob was now trying to rub itself on Seven's ankles. I'm worried that Natalie has adapted to outside, I said eventually. Lozzie peered sideways at me. She's not acting like this place feels wrong to her. She doesn't seem affected by Camelot. I'm worried that could be a bad sign, in the long run. Lozzie pursed her lips and pulled a very serious thinky face. I think that happens to everyone. Maybe. Lozzie was somewhat biased, but I didn't say that out loud. She's gonna be fine, Heathy. You did the right thing. We're doing the right thing. Fine, all fine. And if she needs help, we're gonna be there, right? Lozzie's turned to squeeze my hand. I nodded, lost in thought and worry. Warm cinnamon wind tickled my face and ran gentle fingers over my scalp. This place, this outside realm, Camelot, it was almost like a part of home. A castle on the far side of Evelyn's Gate, garrisoned by Lozzie's knights, that would be one impressive stronghold. Perhaps Evie could even ward it, make it a fortress in a magical sense too. But what was a castle except an outpost of control? But control by what? By me and mine. The knights, the shamblers, the dregs of the Sherrowford cult back home, even Jane and Sevens, Evelyn, my strategist, Rain, my bodyguard. Where was all this going? What was I becoming? I had promised myself that I would not become a monster, that when Maisie saw me again, she would see the sister she remembered, her own face reflected. She would not find a monster wearing my skin. I would not shed everything that makes me who or what I am, just to get her back. I would rescue her and I would stay true to myself. And so far I was doing pretty well at that, I thought. But I was becoming something else. The embryo of a god? No, that had been a delusion in a moment of weakness, encouraged by Sevens for some reason I didn't yet understand. I sighed and turned away from the castle. We had practical matters to solve before I could spend time on the philosophy of power. The corpse of the unknown man stared at the purple sky with blank, dead eyes. Lozzie made a sad little sound again. I held her hand tightly. I had never met this man. I had no idea who he was. In life he may have been a horrible person, he may have committed acts or crimes that would make me hate him, he may have held beliefs that I would have found reprehensible. Or maybe not, maybe he had been a saint. More likely he'd been like the rest of us, somewhere between extremes. Whatever he'd been in life, I wished he could have gone home. I wish we could figure out who he was, I said. Lozzie finally let go of my hand. She spent a few minutes circling the corpse, looking at him from different angles, peering at his dried-out eyeballs and the skin on his hands. I'd half hoped she might be able to work out something that I'd missed, but we had no such luck. I was considering the possibility of using brain math to define him, maybe to trace his history somehow. Even if we couldn't take him home, perhaps we could let his family know what had happened to him. But he was a corpse. What would I find, if I peered into a dead thing? I felt such guilt at not wanting to try. And I didn't understand why. To my surprise, we were joined a couple of minutes later by an unexpected addition to our little group, Stephen Skeets. Down below us, the tour had completed a circuit of the castle. Natalie was busy chattering something to her mother. I think I heard Sevens replying too, and then they vanished inside the keep, perhaps to see the big table. But Stephen detached from the group, nodding some reassurances, and trudged up the hill to join us instead. As he approached he nodded to me with one of those awkward non-smiles and head lifts that older men sometimes use to acknowledge each other. He didn't say anything, but just stood there a few paces away from us, frowning down at the corpse. Stephen Skeets was a very solidly built man, perhaps only half a foot taller than me. In rumpled clothes and sweat-stained shirt, he could have passed for an aging football player after a rough night on the town, if it wasn't for the genuine haunted look in his eyes. Eventually he cleared his throat and wet his lips, but didn't look up from the corpse. I wanted to ask. Here it comes, whispered the bitter voice in my belly. Stephen nodded at the corpse. What happens to him now? The bitter hiss was silent. Hadn't expected that. I drew in a big sigh before replying. We're going to bury him here, I think. I was planning on just a coffin and a hole in the ground. But maybe we can have the knights rustle up a stone sarcophagus or something. Stephen glanced at the knights, then looked away quickly. Still couldn't quite figure them out, could he? He stared at Lozzie for a second, then nodded to her too, then back to the corpse. Who was he? He asked. Not a clue, I said, sounding more prickly than I intended. Somebody else kidnapped by Edward Lilburn. Sorry, you don't know who that is. That's the name of the wizard who kidnapped your daughter. My uncle, said Lozzie, colder and sadder than usual. She pulled a frowny face when Stephen blinked at her in surprise. We're gonna kill him. No worries, she chirped. He nodded along to that too, smiling awkwardly at Lozzie before glancing at me. Can't you take him home? Back to his parents? He looks like he must have been pretty young. I pulled a sad smile. Too risky. The police might find the body, trace it back to us. We can't return him, not safely. Though I would like to find his family, let them know, somehow. We have ways, but... I trailed off in vague guilt. What would it mean, to touch death with brain math? The bitter voice in my chest curled in resentment, like a parasite in my heart. Stephen was just trying to soothe his own guilt, after all. He didn't really care about this man he'd never met. This was simply something he understood, something he could hold on to, make sense of. Using the dead man for his own ends, whispered a part of me I hated to acknowledge. Using the dead for absolution, for some corner of a forgotten field that is forever England, Stephen said. His voice threatened to break. His eyes were full of tears. He sniffed hard and wiped them on his arm. Is that how it goes? I was never good with poetry in school. Foreign field, I corrected him gently. But otherwise, yes. He might not be English, Lozzie said. Could be from anywhere. Anywhere at all. Stephen shook his head. This could have been Nat. This could have been my daughter. This poor bloke, he didn't deserve it, he didn't. Out there, in that swamp. That's no place to die. I'm glad you agree, I said out loud. The bitter, hissing voice in my chest had finally run out of things to say. Stephen looked up at the trio of knights. Can I stand with you for a few minutes? They didn't answer, of course. I cleared my throat gently. They don't communicate like us, but I think you're welcome to join them. We won't be staying much longer, though. We can't risk dawn rising back in England while we're all here. People might wonder where you've gone, and we need to get your story straight, for the police. Stephen nodded, taking it all very seriously. Of course, of course. He went a step around the body, to join the forest night in vigil, but then he paused, staring down at the dead man. I'm not sure I should say this, but have you checked his pockets? For an ID or a wallet or anything? Lozzie and I shared a look. Lozzie snorted and covered her mouth with a corner of poncho. I sighed and rubbed my face with one hand. No, I admitted, somewhat embarrassed. No, we haven't. I'm a little bit squeamish about corpses. I was going to ask Zheng, but reuniting you with Natalie was more important. Here, let me, I used a tentacle, not my hands, but even then it made me cringe with disgust. I should have left this task for Zheng, but I was embarrassed by having missed the obvious solution to the problem. With one tentacle tip I patted down the young man's pockets, found nothing obvious, then steeled myself to poke the tentacle inside, to make sure he wasn't carrying his driving license loose in his baggy jeans. In the left, nothing but lint. But in the right, I found a piece of smooth stone. In shock, I pulled it out of the dead man's pocket, almost fumbling as I transferred it into my hands. Lozzie put a hand over her mouth when she saw. The little greenish stone meant nothing to Stephen, but he froze as well, the shock on my face was too obvious. A piece of flat, greenish soapstone, carved into a 5-pointed star. A stone coin. Exactly like the one Hrinjwindla had gifted to me. What does that mean? Stephen asked. What is it? I took a long moment to gather myself, thoughts whirling inside my head. This wasn't my coin, it was slightly different, cut from a different piece of stone. But it was an example of the same currency, from a place outside that used things like currency. Heathy. Lozzie prompted. I wet my lips and closed my fist around the soapstone coin, staring down at the corpse. It means our dead man here might not be as uninvolved as I first thought. With electric lights blazing against a sluggish northern dawn beyond the thin floral curtains, the Skeets family home felt welcoming and cozy, much better than when Zhang and I had stepped from thin air only a couple of hours earlier, to intrude on the ghostly flicker glow of terrified grief. Now the television was firmly switched off, hands were sensibly washed, faces splashed with cold water, shoes politely placed on the mat by the front door, and cups of strong tea suggested and administered all round. The physical rituals of mutual trust were important, of course, but it was the house itself which unexpectedly grabbed my attention. The house in Prestwich concealed its own age beneath several layers of interior renovation. Isabella and Stephen had filled their home with clean, modern furniture, self-assembled IKEA bookshelves, a tastefully plain dining table with matching chairs of unadorned wood, gauzy curtains with subtle rose designs on the fabric, a sturdy wooden-framed bunk bed for Natalie, despite the fact she was an only child, sensible, solid, soft armchairs and a long sofa, all pointed at the television in the sitting room. None of it was untouched or unused. This was no display home of normality enforced over human need. The table was scuffed from hundreds of dinners, the chair legs showed evidence of Termy's claw marks, and the sofa was worn in, cushions collapsed, probably in need of replacing soon. Natalie's wooden bed frame was covered in stickers of dinosaurs, cute-faced cartoon characters, girl superheroes, and at least one little figure I recognized from a video game which Tenny had been playing recently. Natalie's bedroom was full of pastel chaos, occupied by a large collection of plush toys, with a very well-used set of art supplies scattered about on a small desk. One wall was covered with her own taped-up drawings, mostly cartoon characters. Apparently Natalie was currently going through a phase of drawing superheroes who were also pieces of cheese, or perhaps dinosaurs, or maybe birds. I didn't have time to stop and figure them out, though I did spot one image that was almost certainly meant to be a dinosaur in a trench coat and a pirate hat, but with a lemon in place of the more traditional skull and crossbones symbol. Maybe Natalie could tell me all about Detective Pirate Lemon Rex another day. A good place for a little girl to grow up. A real place, warm and lived in. After a good look at their home, I decided I liked Natalie's parents. But the house itself was older than the family. Not as venerable as number 12, Barnslow Drive, and it had surrendered to the advances of the modern world more readily, but I could feel it in the bones of the place. Between the oddly large kitchen, the rather cramped dining room, and the kinking snake of the stairs, I spied more than a few hints of history beneath the surface: the dark skirting boards from an earlier time, the open space in the kitchen where a large gas oven had probably once stood, the side of the stairs where a railing should have been, and the odd step down from the kitchen to the dining room. I would place the red brick exterior no later than the 1930s. Maybe it was the layout, or the height of the ceilings, or maybe my imagination was running away with me, under the stress and exhaustion of this wearying day. Or maybe I was trying to distract myself from the cool, smooth weight of the soapstone coin in my sweaty palm. Better a mystery I understood than one I couldn't fathom. I had plenty of opportunity to ponder the specifics of the house once we arrived. The very first thing we did, before we'd even finished recovering from the return slip, was to comb the place from top to bottom. While Isabella cradled a nauseated and shivering Natalie, and Stephen was getting his breath back, and Tenny hugged poor confused Termy, and Sevens kept an eye on them all, Zheng and Lozzie and I checked every single room, cupboard, and dark corner we could find. We even looked under the beds, stared into the plug holes in the bathroom, and opened the fridge. We weren't taking any chances with Edward's propensity for clever traps. It was overwhelmingly likely that Natalie had been selected by random chance, simply a little girl in the wrong place at the wrong time, so there was no reason for Edward to booby-trap her family home, like he'd done with Amy Stack's son. But it didn't hurt to check. I made sure to peer into the shadows this time, lest another creature like Marmite use my own assumptions against me. We found nothing except the usual background level of pneumosomatic life. A dwarf thing made of crumbly coal was nested in the back of a kitchen cupboard, a pair of spirits like praying mantises were visible cavorting in the small garden, and a flat, sad, limp mushroom creature was plastered over one of the windows. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing intentional. Nothing watching us back. Once we pronounced the house was safe, we had much to discuss with Isabella and Stephen. We weren't out of the woods just yet. But they were understandably reluctant to part from their daughter for more than a few moments. Not all of the things I had to say were going to be suitable for her ears. Eventually we reached an acceptable compromise. Natalie was to show Tenny her bedroom and her toys, chaperoned by 7 shades of reluctant babysitter, while myself and Lozzie would speak to the parents, with Jing hovering close at hand in case of an emergency on either end. I would have preferred Sevens with me and Lozzie upstairs, just so I could fall back on the eloquence of the Yellow Princess, but we all understood that Natalie needed a proper bodyguard right now, at least until I made it clear that she was in no further danger. Amid all of this, Termy had decided that the best place for a cat was in Lozzie's lap. As soon as we were sat down, he burrowed into her pastel poncho, curled up, and closed his eyes. "Well," Isabella said in a tone of awkward politeness. "If Termy has taken a liking to you, young miss, then I'm certain we can trust you too." "Cat good," Lozzie said with a mischievous little smile. She scratched Termy behind the ears, which earned her a sonorous purr from the old marmalade gentleman. "Good cat. Good cat, yes, good boy, good cat, best boy, yes, it's you. It's you. It's you. He's always been good with Nat, even when she was a newborn. I think that's rare, for cats." "Rare drop cat," Lozzie whispered to Termy. "S-rank cat." Behind the thin curtains dawn was threatening the horizon with a line of dull fire, but this morning was going to be grey and dreary. English summer had forgotten itself, as it so regularly did, leaving us with imitation autumn in the middle of June. It was as if the grey world of the Shamble Swamp had followed us back. Electric lights and hot tea held it at bay for now, but soon there would be rain drumming on the roof. I could taste it in the air. Small footsteps bumped and pattered above our heads, joined by the occasional fluttery trill of Tenny's voice. We'd barely been sat down long enough to take a single sip of tea, but Stephen couldn't keep his eyes from flicking to the ceiling again and again. He looked desperate to stand up and dart to the door, unwilling to leave his daughter alone. Isabella was equally antsy, but she hid it better, behind a polite, calm smile and the tension in her shoulders and neck. Stephen finally muttered a complaint. "Don't you think we should at least be nearby?" I drew in a deep breath, sat up straight, and tried to stop fiddling with the stone coin in my hoodie's front pocket. My thoughts were consumed by the small stone disc, but my role was not over yet. I had to stick to the script. Stephen finally unstuck his eyes from the ceiling, but he looked doubtful. Isabella's smile tightened. "And what about when you leave?" she asked. "Will Natalie be safe, then? Will we be safe? Or are you leaving us to our own devices?" "Natty's not important," Lozzie chirped with a smile. Stephen visibly bristled. "Excuse me?" I winced. The conversation was already getting away from the script in my head, slipping through my fingers. There was supposed to be an order to all this. I'd worked it out, planned what to say, but we were already spiraling off. "What Lozzie means," I said, "is that none of you actually matter to the man who did this, Edward Lilburn, the wizard who kidnapped Natalie. There's no reason for him to come after Natalie again. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time, that's all. There was nothing particularly special about her, she's not connected to anybody who matters, not responsible for anything. There's no reason for him to kidnap her or attack her, or anything like that, not least because it would draw an awful lot of attention from the police. He doesn't want that, any more than I would." Stephen wrapped one hand around his mug of tea and leaned forward over the table, shoulders squared, frowning, unsatisfied. Since we'd gotten back, he'd changed out of his sweat-stained shirt, washed the caked sweat off his face, eaten some kind of energy bar, and downed about 2 whole pints of water and a bottle of some kind of fancy cold brew coffee. The transformation was striking, from a shivering, screaming ape on the edge of the impossible, to a concerned middle-class father at a school parents' evening. I'd broken him outside, forced him to accept reality, but he was putting himself back together with the new information included. I was no longer a terrifying and inexplicable monster to him, I was merely the closest thing he had to an authority. And he wished to file a complaint. "What about that coin you found on the dead man?" he demanded. "You said that meant he was involved. How do you know Natalie isn't involved? How can you be sure there's not some other reason for all this?" I must have given him an exasperated look worthy of Evelyn, because Stephen frowned harder. Lozzie Giggle snorted. Isabella sighed softly and murmured her husband's name with gentle irritation. "It's a reasonable bloody question," Stephen said, glancing at his wife. "She's 10, I deadpanned. So?" I resisted the urge to throttle him with a tentacle. "So, unless she's been sneaking out at night to join a cult, and I think we can rule that out, then I don't think it's possible for her to be involved." Stephen shook his head. "Look, with all due respect, I still don't entirely follow. How can you be sure that?" I pulled the coin of greenish soapstone out of my hoodie's front and slapped it down on the table with a loud clack of stone on wood. Then I hiccuped. The noise was half inhuman, twisted by irritation in the shape of my throat. "I hadn't expected that." Stephen flinched. Isabella blinked. Lozzie made a little murring sound of discomfort. Jane stayed silent, because she probably approved. I'd lost my temper. It was stupid, unnecessary, and unbecoming of the figure I was supposed to be to these people. Authority and knowledge, reassurance in the face of the supernatural truth, a source of safety in the new reality I'd forced them to accept. I would have winced an apology if I wasn't so exhausted, if they hadn't already dragged me off script, and if my mind wasn't whirling with dark possibilities regarding this inexplicable coin. "This coin," I said, then cleared my throat and started over, softer, gentler, though a tickle in my throat made me sound raw. "This coin means that man was probably involved with the supernatural in some fashion. The only way he would find such a thing is by either being a mage, or being involved with a mage, or maybe journeying outside. Maybe he picked it up there, right where he died. I don't know. I do not know. Natalie is 10. The only way she could possibly have been involved prior to being kidnapped is through a family member. If, for example, Edward Lilburn was trying to punish or put pressure on her parents." My tone turned icy cold. I'd wanted to leave this part unsaid, but I couldn't stop myself. They didn't need to know what I'd been preparing to do, if I'd confirmed my worst fears about them, but now they'd asked. Stephen's frown darkened, from polite confusion to a hostile scowl. Hey, we don't." Jing growled, low in her chest, a sound that filled the room and vibrated in one's guts. "Watch your tone, monkey." Stephen balked, going pale and breaking out in cold sweat, staring at Jing and raising both hands. "Jing," I said, "don't, please." Stephen raised a weak protest. "There's no." Isabella spoke clearly, though she was suddenly sweating as well. "We're not involved with anything. We're not. We never knew about any of this until you." "Please, miss," she struggled for a moment, then wet her lips and took a deep breath. "It's all right," I said quickly, horrified by the prospect of her calling me Your Majesty or Your Highness. After all, I owned a castle full of knights, who could blame her? "I don't suspect you of anything, but it's important you understand. Do you know why we checked all the rooms in your house just now?" Stephen swallowed hard. "In case we were lying to you this whole time." I nodded. "The only way Natalie could have prior involvement with the supernatural is via a member of her family. When I found that coin, suddenly I had to decide if one or both of you had been acting for the last couple of hours. The skeets looked like they were being marched to the gallows." I sighed heavily. I hadn't wanted to scare them all over again. "Well," Stephen said, with a level tone that took more courage than it sounded. "We weren't lying. I know you weren't acting, I said. It's probably impossible to fake what I just put you through. And we found no sign of anything in your house, no hidden sigils or wards or magic circles. You're in the clear, I believe you. But I had to be sure. The way they both looked at me made me feel like the worst kind of filth. Like peasants who'd been gifted a reprieve by their lord, sinners absolved by the grace of a god, like a shadow had passed over their souls and left them untouched, but might return again if they said the wrong words. I suddenly wanted to curl up in a ball and put my head in Lozzie's lap. What would you have done? Isabella asked quietly. If you'd found anything? I stared back at her for a moment. My eyes ached. Do you really want to know? Jing rumbled the answer for me. The shaman would have killed you both. I winced and closed my eyes. Lozzie made a soft whining noise and concentrated hard on petting Termy. Purring filled the air. I would have had to figure out if the kidnapping was actually you offering her up willingly, I said. And if it was, then I would have killed you both, yes. I smiled, one of the most awkward smiles of my entire life. Those were not words you followed with a smile. But that's not the case. We're okay. You're okay. Everything is fine. Natalie was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's all. It's important you understand that. Right, Stephen said. Poor man was sweating bullets. All he'd done was ask a reasonable question, and here I was admitting I'd been planning to kill him. Lozzie had curled up tighter in her chair too. She didn't like talk about killing and violence, unless it was about her own family. Isabella smiled back as best she could, maintaining eye contact with me. I didn't like what that meant. More specifically, I went on, trying to reassure them, Edward Lilburn was feeding stray pets to a sort of monster. I think he happened to be passing by when Termy got out of your back door. Natalie followed the cat and scooped him up, but Edward was already in the process of sending the cat outside. Wrong place, wrong time, like I keep saying. Termy got lucky, Lozzie said, nodding seriously. Nat saved him. She looked down at the cat and went all baby voice. Lucky cat, do you know that, Termster? Do you know? You do. Mert, went Termy. Stephen was still frowning at me, but now with a kind of distant, echoed horror behind his eyes. When he reached for his mug of tea, his hand shook slightly. Not for the first time, I worried about the long-term effects of what I'd done to these two. I needed to be reassuring them, not threatening them. Why was this coming so easily to me? Because you're still treating them like your own parents, said that bitter voice in my chest. Because you want to punish them. I took a deep breath and rejected that entire concept. I had to be better. I'm sorry about all this, I said, going even further off script myself. I'm sorry you have to deal with this. You seem like decent people, you shouldn't have to. It's not fair, it's never fair when this happens, when mages and magic and bullshit gets. Why did you have to do that to us? Stephen asked softly, his voice breaking. He cleared his throat and tried again. I mean taking us outside. Showing us like that. He may not have known it, but Stephen had just thrown me a lifeline. I was determined to loop it around him and his wife and haul them to shore. Because you had to be broken, I said. And I'm sorry I had to do that, but it was the only way. You had to be exposed directly if you were ever going to believe a word of this. Gotta see for yourself. Lozzie chimed in. You don't believe, otherwise. Couldn't you have just told us? I shook my head. That's not how reality works. At least to the best of our knowledge. I drew myself up and tried to think of myself as Evelyn again, tried to adopt the tone she'd used back when she'd first explained this all to me. The human mind naturally rejects the supernatural, the products of outside introduced to our reality. Our minds filter things out and come up with alternative explanations, unless we're pushed past the point where exposure breaks us, so we can put ourselves back together with the new information properly reincorporated. I sighed inside. My improvisation was terrible compared with Evelyn's metaphor of the castle, but it was close enough for now. But, Stephen insisted. You could have shown us something, tried something first, anything. When you felt the invisible force of my tentacles, did you believe right away? Or were you trying to explain it somehow, inside your own head? Stephen frowned harder, thinking carefully. But Isabella blinked in surprise. I was thinking of magnets, she said. Lozzie hid a giggle behind one hand. Magnets? I echoed. My goodness, Isabella went on, almost awestruck. My lady, you're correct. When you grabbed me, I'm sorry, when you restrained me, on the sofa, I thought you were somehow using magnets. Steve, she's right. My mind did exactly what she just described. Yeah, Stephen said, staring at me with fresh horror. Yeah, Izzy, yeah, you're right. And out in the swamp, I was sure it was all a projection. Like in a white room or something. Shit. I cleared my throat and failed to contain my irritated tone. Isabella, why did you just call me my lady? Isabella blinked those big brown eyes at me, innocently wary. Sevens, she said. When we were waiting, I asked her how to address you. She said that would be proper. Should I be more? She glanced at Jane, but got no reply. She was trying to be respectful. A difficult needle to thread. I failed to contain an exasperated sigh. At least Sevens had the good sense not to give them my family name, but that was scant comfort. Lozzie snorted a laugh. Heathy is Heathy. It's not funny, I snapped at her. The shaman is the shaman, Jing said. Isabella looked uncomfortable. But. Heather, I snapped my own name. That's what you call me. Heather. Isabella bobbed her head in deference, with more than a touch of fear. Made me feel sick at myself. Heather, she repeated. I'm sorry. I took a moment to gather myself before speaking again. Had I always been this cruel? The reason I had to break you, I said. Natalie's mind was already reconditioned by spending a night alone in that swamp. We call it being in the know. She didn't have a choice in the matter. And that means in the future she might see supernatural things for what they are. It's not likely she'll run into anything, it's actually quite rare, but it's possible. Without her parents similarly reconditioned, she would have nobody to turn to. Stephen gestured at me. Isabella cleared her throat as if to tell him off for the gesture. What about you? He asked. Can she turn to you? Always, I said on reflex. But wouldn't you want to know why your daughter is friends with a woman twice her age? And now you do. Ah. Well. Stephen cleared his throat. When you put it like that. I nodded. We'll leave it a few weeks, maybe a month or two, just because of the police and the news media, but I would like to maintain some kind of contact with Natalie, yes. Even if just to let her know that we're here for her if she needs it. I smiled and tried to look warm again. Plus, she has taken a liking to Tenny. Tenny doesn't have any friends her own age. This might be good for her, too. Well. I understand if you're wary about that. Tenny is a good girl, said Lozzie, in a sort of sad voice. Good baby. I pulled my smile tighter. I was leaving out one essential detail, of course, in a few months' time, I might be dead. We might all be dead, just a collection of bones covered in black ash in Wonderland. I tried not to think about that. But Natalie and her parents had to be prepared, even without anybody left to guide them. I'm sorry, but you still haven't really answered my question, said Isabella. What happens when you leave? Perhaps she saw right through me. Or perhaps she was just asking a sensible question. It wouldn't be a good use of time to cry on these shoulders, though. When Edward sees the news that Natalie turned up home safe and sound, he'll know it was us who got her back. She's under our protection, my protection. We'll make this explicit when we next communicate with him. We've sent letters and stuff through a lawyer, we have a line of communication. Natalie is off limits. Or else what? Stephen asked. Then he did a little sigh and a grumble. You already said you're planning to kill this man. What leverage have you got? I stared back at him for a heartbeat, then dropped the act, the serious act, the I know what I'm doing act. Letting him live, I said. Lozzie hissed through her teeth. She didn't like that idea at all. Zheng rumbled in disgust. All right, I sighed. Pretending that we'll let him live. More importantly, we can set up your house and Natalie herself with magical protection, the kind of tripwire that he won't dare risk coming into contact with. We've done it once before, for somebody else. Stephen and Isabella shared a look. This didn't seem to be reassuring them. I'm sorry, I said, then hiccuped. I'm not very good at doing this. I know I'm not very reassuring, but it's the best I can think of. The best I can muster. I'm sorry I can't do more. Once he's dead, you'll have no more worries about this. Stephen cleared his throat gently. Why does she matter to you? Why do you care? I already told you that. I went through something similar. I won't let it happen to another child. Beneath the table, Lozzie's small, warm hand wormed into mine. She squeezed hard. I kept talking. I don't want your girl to turn out like me, misdiagnosed with schizophrenia, gaslit by the entire world. My parents denied what happened to me, it's not their fault, but the damage it did is. I stared across that bare wooden table and tried very hard not to see my own parents sitting on the other side. How absurd. Isabella was practically my mother's polar opposite, willowy and elfin and graceful, soft-spoken and poised and careful. Stephen had all the underlying assertive nature my own father lacked, not to mention he didn't have a beard. Also they were a lot younger, closer to my age than to my parents. Yet for a moment my words stuck in my throat. In my head I was back in Signet Children's Hospital, protesting to Mummy that I was seeing monsters, crying out because nobody would stop lying to me, nobody would stop saying that Maisie wasn't real. People needed to stop treating me like a leader, or a messiah, or a god, because no matter how much I denied it, no matter how many layers of safety I wrapped around my core, how many understanding friends I made, how much I wrought my truth with the flesh of my own body, part of me would always be that scared little girl for whom reality had stopped making sense. Natalie's plight had thrust it all to the forefront of my mind. All my casual aggression and calculated cruelty, was it all just to avoid this frank conversation with avatars from my own past? Surrogate parents were asking me why I cared about my surrogate self, and the answers I had were no different to when I was 9 years old, because the world had stopped making sense. I grabbed the stone coin off the table with a sweating, shaking hand. A terrifying mystery, but better than talking to Mum and Dad about the truth. I stared at it, opened my mouth to say something stupid, like, it's time we left, then, we're done here, goodbye. Zheng came to my rescue with a dark purr from the deeper shadows. The shaman sees further than you monkeys. She sees truth. Your pup will not. Both skeets stared at Zheng in the manner one looks toward a bear appearing around a copse of trees. She was right though. Natalie would not suffer like me. That brought me back. 2. I blinked and took a deep breath and hit the ground running, speaking too fast, uncaring that it probably made minimal sense to Isabella and Stephen. Yes, Natalie won't have to deal with even a fraction of what I do. She can't see spirits, she won't have the nightmares. But she's still been exposed to the supernatural, and I don't want another child to go through what I did, that's why I care, that's what matters. So I'll do my best to protect her. That's why I care. You understand? Is that enough? Can we move on to practical matters now? The sun is rising, and you two need to have your story ready for the police. Stephen raised one hand. Wait. All this talk about protection. What about the police? Lozzie perked up. Termy did too, he must have felt it through her lap. Lozzie tilted her head to one side and waited. A cold hand reached into my gut as I realized, the Skeets believed, but they didn't understand. I hadn't prepared for this. It wasn't in my script. What about them? I echoed, buying time. They'll never help you, Lozzie whispered. Well, Stephen looked between the pair of us. Isn't there any kind of? Can they really do nothing? Isabella asked. I almost wanted to put my squid skull mask back on. Hide behind the inhuman face that was closer to the real me. Instead, inside my mind, I spoke with Evie's voice. My words came out with surprising clarity. There is no ministry for magic, I said. No men in black, no secret Q-division in a government office somewhere. There's no council of mages, or local werewolf clan, or a nightclub full of vampires. There's nothing. There's no supernatural government or institutions or laws. There's just madmen, monsters, and mages, and very, very rarely, there's people like me and my friends. And we're monsters too, yes, but we're not monstrous. Don't investigate the supernatural, don't start buying occult books, don't go to the newspapers or paranormal websites or anything like that, because all you'll do is risk unwanted attention. Do you understand? Stephen stared at me in wordless shock, mouth hanging open. I assumed, well, I don't know what I assumed, but that's. We're on our own, Isabella said. Not completely, I corrected her gently. It's basically warlordism, yes. But we're the local power block, and we don't let mages kill children. Stephen started laughing, dark and a little overwhelmed. So, which is it? Adopted daughter of an alien god? Don't think I forgot that one, or queen of Camelot, or warlord warlady of Manchester. We're not actually based in Manchester, I said with a sigh, taking extra care with my words. I was pretty certain the Skeets were not going to approach the police, but I still didn't want to tell them we were from Sherrowford. But for these purposes, our jurisdiction extends here, yes. Zheng chuckled from the shadows in the corner, a low rumble between sharp teeth. Warlord, shaman. I froze, blushing, realizing I'd basically just agreed to that without a second thought. I mean, I let out a sharp huff at Stephen, then grabbed my mug of tea in a tentacle and took a deep drink of the lukewarm brew, before clacking it down in open irritation. Termy peered over the lip of the table at that. A hiccup further undermined my unasked-for authority. Fine. Yes, I'm all of those things and more. Is that what you want? You want a local ruler to worship? All right, you've got it. But not just me alone. I'm not a warlord. Warlady, really. I tooted and shook my head, knowing that Rain would have loved that word. I was glad she wasn't present to hear it. Though you're not going to meet the rest of us, for safety. Zheng purred curiously. It would be a good title, shaman. Warlady. I could tell she was teasing me. Something about the amused hitch in her voice. I steadfastly ignored Zheng's suggestion and focused on Natalie's parents. Now, if you are quite done, we need to discuss practical matters, preferably before any of your family contacts you, or a police officer knocks on your door. Now. But both Stephen and Isabella were having a very hard time looking away from the mug I'd just drunk from. I rolled my eyes, out of patience. No, I don't possess powers of telekinesis, I said. I was lifting it with a tentacle. You saw them already. Isabella smiled and nodded, polite but on the edge of losing something important. Stephen cleared his throat with obvious concern, then said, carefully, may I ask why we could see them when we were outside, but not here? My tentacles are made from a special type of matter. Generally you have to be non-human, or extra-human, in order to see them, or anything else made from that matter. All three of us here, I indicated myself, Lozzie, and Zheng with a sideways nod, can see them clearly. You can't. We have some special glasses which can allow for a human to see, but giving you a pair might be a bad idea for your mental health. Try not to think about that, please. Stephen shared an unreadable look with his wife, then a covert, polite glance at Lozzie. But nobody could sneak around the master sneaker. Lozzie flashed back a big smile and a broad wink, giggling in her seat as she petted Termy. Isabella and Stephen may have finally managed to make sense of me, and Zheng was visibly not a human being, but Lozzie looked like an ordinary girl, at least on the surface. They didn't seem to know how to process that. I watched them both very carefully. These two were only freshly broken in, their minds still adapting to this new reality. Lozzie looked ordinary, yet she was not. I needed them to accept this, for their daughter's sake, but I suspected it was possible to push them too far. Natalie will not turn out like us, I said out loud. She's a human being, and will remain so. She can't see my tentacles either. Stephen sighed with unconcealed relief, then had the good grace to wince with apology. Isabella managed to remain neutral, trying not to anger the God Queen Warlord Squid across the table from her. We are what we pretend to be, I thought. So what am I being right now? Practical matters, I said, somewhat sharper than I intended. Practically problems. Lozzie chirped. Listen to the shaman, Zheng rumbled. Closely. Stephen nodded and pulled himself up in his chair, nodding seriously. Right, of course. What do you want us to tell the police? Isabella spoke up before I could stick to the script. We tell them she came home, of course. She wandered off. She had an adventure. I nodded along. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, your daughter spent the last 24 hours on the adventure of a lifetime for a 10-year-old, wandering around Manchester with her cat. Lozzie's already coached her, and will do some more before we leave, because the police will undoubtedly want to hear it from Natalie herself. She knocked on the back door in the middle of the night and woke you up, and you found her there. That's all. With the cat, Lozzie added. In her lap, Termy opened sleepy, bleary eyes again and added a soft-throated MMRR to the proceedings. With Termy, I added. That's the important part. The newspapers will love that. A feel-good story about a girl and her cat, a silly puff piece that people won't really read. They'll move on within a day or two. With any luck it won't even hit the BBC as anything other than a 10-second piece. I was echoing Rain's words, but I only half believed them myself. It would take some serious effort for the police to accept this without question, at least privately. In public they would express relief and close the case. But one or two canny detectives might start to ask questions behind closed doors. We'd have to wait that out. Stephen nodded, but I could see that Isabella was harboring some similar doubts to myself. I caught her eyes and nodded gently, letting her know that I understood. We were taking a gamble here. Secondly, I went on, is the issue of Natalie's health. That certainly took their attention away from the issue of what to tell the police. Stephen froze, but Isabella didn't waste a beat. The mud, she said, mouth hanging open. Oh my God. In that swamp, the mud. It was filthy. The mud, yes, I said. It's safe. Lozzie chirped. She's clean, there's no infections or nasties or anything like that. I triple-checked. Termy too. She petted Termy on the head when the cat looked up at the sound of his own name. Lozzie knows what she's doing when it comes to bodies and medical issues, I said. And I trust her judgment about this. But she's clean. Lozzie chirped at me with mounting irritation. Heathy. We can't be 100% certain. Lozzie grumbled. She curled up and gave Termy a hug. The same goes for Termy. I addressed Natalie's parents again. They did not look reassured by this exchange. We can't be 100% certain that neither of them ingested anything from the swamp, or that they're completely free of infection. You need to watch both of them very, very carefully over the next few days and weeks. But, Stephen swallowed. But a doctor isn't going to. Exactly. If Natalie gets some outsider illness or infection, don't take her to a doctor or the hospital. Contact us. We have other ways of solving that kind of problem, if it happens. It probably won't. But if it does. Isabella frowned delicately and spoke with exacting precision. You seem uncomfortable, Heather. She said my name with obvious reluctance. Probably wanted to call me, Your Grace. My turn to freeze with self-conscious fear. I stared at my mug. Well. It's complicated. I understand that we can't possibly comprehend everything about your world. I accept that, on your word. But you need to share everything about my daughter's health. Everything. When I glanced back up, that burning dedication had returned to Isabella's eyes, the same look I'd seen on her when I'd arrived in her sitting room and pinned her to the sofa, the look which said she would do anything for her child. She would reach across this table and slap a god if she had to. And she did think I was some kind of god. Zheng purred from the dark, the shaman speaks of sharing flesh with flesh. I sighed and allowed my shoulders to slump. Zheng, please don't. I am touched by the shaman's blessing. It kept my blood free of vermin, twice. She would do the same for your pup, if only asked. I wanted to get out of my chair and throttle Zheng. One of my tentacles pointed toward her in silent threat, but she stared it down. The skeets looked even more confused than before. Lazi grabbed another one of my tentacles, wounded about her arm, then hugged it to her chest, as if to comfort me or restrain me. All right, fine, I said. My body produces certain unique antibodies, I suppose. I've shared them with people before and it's helped fight off supernatural or extradimensional infections. If Natalie was to develop some kind of problem, then it might be worth the risk. What risk? Isabella demanded. I have no idea, I deadpanned, out of patience. This isn't a tested medical procedure. I'm not talking about something clean and modern here, I'm talking about probably feeding her a spoonful of my blood. Isabella's mouth made a little O shape of unspoken shock. Stephen put one hand to his own mouth. I have no idea what it's done to other people in the long run, I went on, thinking of Rain, who had shared my blood by proxy, from Zheng. But it would be better than the alternative, but only if Natalie gets sick. Like communion, Stephen murmured in awe. The look in his eyes made my stomach turn over and my blood curdle. It's not communion. I snapped suddenly, surprising even myself. Stephen flinched hard. But Isabella stared at me with that look I hated more than all others, growing religious adoration. Her husband's feeling had been sharp and quick, but hers had deeper roots that I could not seem to dislodge. Perhaps she'd been waiting all her life for a god to step into it. It's not communion, I repeated. I'm not literally a god. My blood doesn't have magical properties. Well, okay, I suppose it does. But I'm not a god, stop looking at me like that. Stephen shook his head. You said you're the daughter of an alien god. What does that mean? Adopted daughter. And that's why you have tentacles. And in all the rest of it. The teleporting thing. I glared at him, but that had the opposite of my intended effect. The poor man began to bow his head. Stop that. I snapped. No. Well, yes. Sort of. I'm not a god, that's all. Or a messiah. I'm just a young woman in a very difficult situation. I realize that you're thankful I saved your daughter, but stop thinking of me like that. This was so much worse than with the Brinkwood cult, the Hoptons, Twill's family. At least they were already worshipping an outsider, sliding me into their rather thin pantheon had felt offensive and horrifying, but at least it made some kind of sense. But this? This was all my fault. This was because I'd presented myself as the Eye's daughter in order to overawe them, to break their minds. And then I'd revealed myself as human, or at least looking like a human, and I thought that had settled the matter. But here they were, clinging to driftwood pieces of their new cosmology whenever I gave them an opening. Was this why cults happened? Was this why outsiders could seem like gods? Because people needed an explanation to cling to, once they were in the know. And Natalie's parents were using me as the new guidepost to their world. I had saved their child, delivered them from evil, and now they couldn't help themselves. Stephen nodded along politely, looking suitably ashamed. But the look in his wife's eyes told me she would not accept my own denial. She'd believed it on the shores of the great swamp, in her moment of need, and she believed it now, with her child returned, salvation delivered, and the offer of a blood bond with the messenger from beyond. She was ready to argue with the divine about the status of its own divinity. But then she lowered her eyes to her own folded hands. I have half a mind to ask you to do it right now. For Nat's sake. Bloody hell, Izzy, said Stephen. No, not unless we need to. Come on now. This is what magic is like, this is what the supernatural is like, I said. There's no waving wands and chanting some magic words to make something go back to the way it was before. If Natalie sickens as a result of her exposure, then sharing my antibodies with her may be a sensible choice. But that choice isn't mine to make, so I didn't. A very awkward few moments of silence fell over the cramped dining room. Isabella sat staring down at her own clasped hands. I hoped she wasn't praying, at least not to me. Stephen drained the rest of his tea and nodded a thanks across the table, not just to me either, but to Lozzie and Jing too. That was a better sign. Lozzie picked Termy up out of her lap and placed him on the table, which prompted him to go over to Isabella and nuzzle her hands, which finally snapped her out of her own thoughts. She idly petted the cat, smiling with distant relief. Jing, I said, do you have the piece of paper? Jing grunted an affirmative. She detached herself from the shadows like a great pillar in motion, strode to the table, and produced a piece of folded paper from inside her trench coat. She slid it across the tabletop, toward Natalie's parents. There's an email address written there, I said as Isabella picked up the piece of paper and unfolded it. We'll be in contact with you soon enough, as I said, but if anything happens to Natalie, if she gets unwell with seemingly no cause, send an email to that address and we'll know. And you'll appear in the middle of our living room? Stephen asked. He was only half joking. I shrugged and sighed. Probably. I pushed my chair back. It's almost dawn, time for us to get moving. I'd like to say bye to Nat though. Isabella nodded. Of course. You've a right to. What right? I thought, but I kept that doubt to myself. I didn't want to get into a theological debate about myself. At least the final problem of the morning was a relatively sweet one. Natalie and Tenny did not wish to be parted so soon. On Natalie's end, Tenny was a fascinating new friend with lots of hands, so she could hold 8 or 10 of Natalie's plush toys and plastic robots all at once, facilitating a very elaborate game of make-believe. That's what we discovered them doing, upstairs in Natalie's bedroom, with Sevens looking on and quietly providing dramatic prompts. On Tenny's end, Natalie was the only friend she'd ever made who was close to her own age. This was the first time she'd played with another child. She didn't even look sheepish or embarrassed about playing make-believe with toys. Still a little girl, then, even if she was growing up fast. Can Nat visit? Visit for playtime? Tenny trilled, asking me and Lozzie alternately. She looked quite sad. Please. In the future, I told her, not wanting to actually lie. But it'll have to be a while until then. Remember? Things have to be secret. Secret things, Tenny trilled in irritation, then puffed her cheeks out. So much like her mother. Octopus lady knows best. Natalie assured Tenny, patting her on the head, both hands in the fine white fur that covered Tenny's skull. Tenny had 3 tentacles attached to Natalie in return, the Tenny version of holding hands and refusing to let go. Apparently I did know best. Tenny was sad and grumpy, Isabella stood by in great discomfort, and Stephen awkwardly shook Tenny's hand, the end of one of her tentacles, but amongst all this, Natalie was serious and beaming, as if she knew better than her parents. She hugged Tenny goodbye, accepted the returned Termy, then went back to hug Lozzie. She even hugged Sevens, which Sevens returned with all the grace of a real princess. I hugged Natalie goodbye too, which almost made me tear up, though I didn't understand why until I pulled back and started talking. "Don't be afraid of anything, Nat," I told her, doing my best to control my own emotions, for her sake. "You might see things, but you're safe. You're safe because I brought you back, okay?" Tenny told me too. "You remember all the things you need to tell the police?" Natalie nodded. "I went for a long walk about Manchester. All the ghosty stuff didn't happen. Secret. But Termy was there." "Secret," trilled Tenny. She was petting Termy goodbye for now. The cat rubbed himself against her tentacles in return. "Smart girl," said Sevens. "You're going to be safe," I told her. "Nothing's going to take you away, okay? Your parents both love you very much, and they understand. And so do I, and you can see Tenny again sometime soon. Nothing is going to take you away from home. I promise." Little Natalie nodded up at me as I stood back up, with one gentle hand on her head. She trusted me, because I'd saved her, from outside and from the disbelief of return. It took an effort of will to remove my hand and let go, because in a very real way I was letting go of my past self. But Natalie wasn't me. She was going to fare much better than I ever had. She had her parents on her side, and a guardian to watch over her for now, even if I rejected any notion that I was a guardian angel. She understood what had happened, she would not grow up confused and lost, and she would never have nightmares of the eye. The me who had returned from Wonderland, the scared little girl, the Heather who had sobbed herself to sleep for years because nothing made sense, she would always carry those scars. But I could find better ways to cradle her in my heart. I could acknowledge those wounds and tend them better, and she would have no reason to feel such bitterness. Natalie would never have to deal with that. Here, at least, I'd done some good. Even if I died in Wonderland in a couple of months' time, this child would not grow up in pain. 2 soapstone coins sat side by side on the table in Evelyn's magical workshop. Greenish like copper oxide, smooth as if passed through thousands of hands, their 5 points now rounded and soft, if they had ever been sharp in the first place. Like a slightly more jagged version of a 50-pence piece. Veins and layers in the stone seemed to catch the light, as if always on the edge of sparking into something greater, as if about to reveal crystalline depths to their material structure. They weren't really soapstone, of course. They were from outside. I'd been staring at the coins for almost 10 minutes while toweling off my wet hair after a morning shower, wondering if I should bother doing anything but going straight back to bed that day, when I was interrupted. "Have they divulged any secrets, kitten?" "Ah." I jumped, but only a little. After all, I knew the voice of the Yellow Princess all too well. Sevens had ghosted into the room while I'd been staring at the coins. Her umbrella was absent, her hands folded in front of her yellow skirt, almost like Preem. "Sevens," I tooted. "Don't surprise me like that, I might belt you with my tentacles." She shrugged delicate shoulders beneath a crisp white blouse. "So be it. Belt me if you must." I scowled at her, suddenly quite serious. 7 shades of sunlight, we are engaged. If I ever hit you, turn me over to your father, please. I tooted. "Don't even joke about that." Sevens tilted her head upward, sharp cold eyes somehow bright even in the artificial glow. With the gloomy day outdoors, the light streaming through the kitchen window and reflecting into the magical workshop was providing only a slow, gray trickle, so I had all the lights on. It did rather demystify the space. "As you will, kitten," she said. I tooted and flushed, then pulled the towel off my head and nodded at the coins on the table. "To answer your question, no. I still haven't the foggiest. Evie has theories, of course, but nothing new. Unless she's found the answers in a dream. Is she awake yet? Haven't the foggiest. It was 2 days since we'd returned Natalie to her parents, safe and sound. We'd all spent most of yesterday recovering, sleeping off an exhausting night and waiting to see if our gambles had worked. Yesterday evening we had been rewarded with almost exactly what Rain had predicted. The evening news had run a very absurd puff piece about the missing girl who had wandered the back roads of Manchester with her orange tomcat as her only companion. The BBC had a much more flattering picture of Termy than the grainy photograph from the newspaper. He was looking almost regal, if a bit battered by age. Natalie herself was kept firmly out of the view of any cameras. Her father, poor old Stephen, was interviewed by somebody outside his own front door, for all of one single-line soundbite about his brave and adventurous daughter. The brave part was genuine, I could tell by his voice. An official police statement followed, wrapping everything up. Then, last and most certainly least, some talking head from Manchester bemoaned how no member of the public had alerted the police to a small girl wandering around the city unaccompanied. But Termy had been with her, so that was okay. A girl and her cat, alone against the world. The police sirens we half expected never materialized. We weren't raided on suspicion of kidnapping or worse. And Edward, if he was planning a move, was lying low for now. However, there was no rest for the wicked. I had a dozen things on my exhausted mind, making me feel numb and stretched thin. Rain was currently out, picking up Sarika and then driving her to the hospital, where Badger was getting discharged that afternoon. On the far side of the magical workshop, Edward's bizarre contraption of metal and glass sat safely contained inside a precautionary magic circle, waiting for Evelyn's attention. The thing was probably inert. The spider servitors didn't care about it, and even Marmite hadn't given it a second glance. We were expecting a phone call from Felicity later that day. She'd sent a text message last night asking if we were willing to discuss a plan. We were, provisionally, but I didn't like the idea. Tenny was sulky and grumpy and I was consumed with worry about her long-term well-being. She couldn't go on being cooped up in this house forever, but what options did we have? And 7 Shades of Sunlight had spent every minute since our return in her yellow princess form. I hadn't seen a peep out of the blood goblin mask. As far as I knew, she hadn't even slept. And now she was here, alone with me. Well, alone except for Marmite, but spiders tell no tales. At least, pneumosomatic ones don't. I pretended to focus on drying my hair again as I watched Sevens watching me back. She watched me watching her. I watched her, watching. Sevens. I said with a sigh. You know we need to talk, don't you? I know a great many things. She sounded both cold and amused at once. Are you going to visit your new holding today? I blinked several times. My what? I'm sorry. The castle, at Camelot. Oh. No, not right now. There's too many things to do. Too many things to think about. We need to ask Cringewindla about these coins, for a start, somehow. Probably through Amanda. But you and I do need to talk. That's a pity. Camelot is a very pretty place, even if it is a bit silly. If we're going to talk, perhaps we should talk in a place where your rule is without question, no? My rule? I squinted at her. Oh, Sevens, no. Really? I've been a very bad girl, my queen. 7 Shades of Sunlight, masked with the face of the Yellow Princess, the rightful daughter of the king in yellow, stared back at me across the otherwise deserted magical workshop. I was struck speechless for a long moment, half in disbelief, half with distaste. Between her ramrod-straight posture, her wide unsmiling turquoise eyes, her perfectly straight-cut blonde hair, her crisp white blouse, and ankle-length yellow skirt, the princess mask was often too much for me to handle, even when she wasn't trying to overawe me. She held herself forever poised on the knife edge of aristocratic arrogance. It would take only one errant twist in the direction of her gaze, one haughty tilt of her chin, one dismissive flick of her fingertips, for her to radiate a sunburst of disdain and superiority. But she chose not to, and instead remained positioned in the liminal space of effortless potential. It was somehow more unnerving. And certainly more attractive. But not right now, not with those specific words. I tried to laugh it off, but I managed only a single, hollow chuckle. Sevens, if you're trying to flirt, then that's in very poor taste. Maybe if you said that while wearing your vampire mask. I trailed off, finding no handhold on her unreadable and icy regard. 7 shades of seditious supplicant tilted her head to the side by a few degrees. Do you really believe I'm flirting, Your Grace? TCH. I tooted reflexively, scowling at her. Sevens, don't call me that. My apologies. What style would my ladyship prefer? Style? I was so flustered and taken aback as she galloped ahead of me, I walked right into the trap. Ladyship? Of address. It's only proper, isn't it? I am foreign royalty still, until we are properly wed, and then I may take all the liberties of personal intimacy. Will you copy the forebears of your homeland? Will you adopt Your Majesty, and Your Royal Highness? I still had the damp towel in my hands from drying my hair, I almost threw it at her in embarrassed outrage. Sevens, stop. It's not funny. Of course not, no. You are not Queen of England, that would be immensely confusing. We should create a proper title for you. Regina Externus. She rolled the words around her mouth like a draught of exotic wine, eyes going up and to the side, followed by a dainty shake of her head. As if I wasn't standing there going red in the face, watching this nonsense. No, that sounds like an obscure disease of the lower parts. How about Domina Polypus? That would include all your other, non-queenly roles in one title, for all your realms and responsibilities. Simplicity is a sound advantage in rulership. I spat a laugh of offended disbelief, it was that or stare in speechless shock. You're being serious, aren't you? Sometimes I forget you're technically an aristocrat. What is this? Where is this coming from all of a sudden? Why, from me, Your Grace. A hint of mockery in her tone set me off, like frozen acid. I couldn't tell how much of this was a joke, or at whose expense. I was already mortified by how close I'd come to giving in, back in the shamble swamp, to that unspeakable impulse to present myself as a false god. Stop calling me that. I snapped. I didn't know what to do with the damp towel in my hands, standing there with my hair all messy and my skin flushed from the shower, so I twisted the towel in my fists, feeling impotent. I'm not a queen, or a messiah. I am not going to set myself up as the leader of a cult, and certainly not play some kind of god gambit on a pair of terrified people and a race of outsider swamp creatures. Sevens didn't even blink. As if she'd expected my every word. I sense my lady of the squiddly crown is somewhat vexed. I rolled my eyes at that one. Who wouldn't? Now you're just taking the mickey. Thanks for that. And yes. For your information, I am quite angry about what you tried to do. What you tried to encourage me to do, back in that swamp. Is this about that? This is your second attempt? Trying to bully me into doing something I shouldn't. To my great surprise, Sevens raised a single eyebrow in a skeptical arch. Angry? Yes. Of course I'm angry. My impending rant was interrupted by the patter of footsteps through the ceiling overhead. Somebody was up on their feet and moving around upstairs, probably Tenny or Evelyn. The tread was too heavy for Lozzie and too imprecise for Preem. But I was suddenly hyper-aware of being overheard, deeply uncomfortable with the notion of anybody else stumbling across this growing argument, especially Evelyn or Lozzie. Even Zheng would be barely tolerable, though I didn't know where she was right that moment. Probably either sleeping or out hunting. More importantly, I didn't understand exactly why I was so uncomfortable. What did I have to hide? But still, I cut off my snapping anger and swallowed hard, eyes glued to the ceiling, tentacles curling tight as if to protect my core from an unseen attack. 7 shades of sarcastic vassalage cleared her throat in a perfect little ahem-ahem sound. Perhaps we should retire to a location where your grace can vent her mind without fear of interruption. The new castle, perhaps. I rolled my eyes and hissed. Please stop talking about me in the third person, Sevens. You've made your point. I don't believe I have, actually. Her tone was still ice cold. I felt myself shiver, my tentacles curling tighter, sweat breaking out down my back. And I'd just showered, too. Sevens loved me dearly, she had put her very nature on the line for me, had thrown herself into my defense during the incident with Fringewindla, and had literally gifted me with a piece of her selfhood. But here she was, staring me down, not flirting at all, but expressing a combination of distaste and concern. I sighed. Sevens, if you're trying to make a point, then just make it. There's no need for this game playing. Do you not wish to express your irritation, my lady? I couldn't help but give her a very unimpressed look. Just say what you mean. Please. Then I rest my case, said 7 shades of smug little brat. Shall we retire to Camelot for a few moments, so we may speak frankly? I slapped the damp towel over my shoulder and raked my fingertips through my wet hair, trying to look casual but probably just coming off as deeply artificial. No, thank you. I've had quite enough of slipping for a bit. 2 days ago I slipped 8 times. 9 times? I can't even count. I still feel slightly abstracted, loose inside my own body, like I'm going to wander off in an astral journey if I'm not careful. So, no, thank you. That was a lie. It was true that all those slips had left me feeling drained and weird, like I'd run a marathon on the phantom limbs of my own soul, muscles sore and strained in places that I didn't have muscles. But the feeling had faded by the end of yesterday, my bioreactor doing its job in keeping me topped up. I still had limits, undoubtedly, and I was afraid to approach them lest something go horribly wrong, but I was currently more than capable of slipping with relative ease. I just didn't want to, though I didn't know why. Because Sevens was being irritating? Because I was afraid of what she might say, outside and unfettered? Because I was afraid of what I might say? Like a coward, I shrank from the true confrontation which was brewing here. Sevens waited a beat, for me to say more, as if she knew I was making it all up. I turned away and started using a corner of the towel to dry the back of my neck, unable to meet Sevens' eyes. Besides, I said, trying to sound casual, I was fooling nobody, I sounded like a 12-year-old attempting to hide a tantrum. Don't you have your own method of slipping? Couldn't you offer to make it easier on me, for once? When you take a step, it does not force others to walk with you. They must take a step themselves. You forget what I am, kitten. I looked round at Sevens, half shocked, half relieved to be called something that wasn't a royal title. She was deadly serious, or at least unreadable enough that I couldn't see through the mask. But she dropped the nonsense, at last. I am sorry, Sevens. I sighed, mostly at myself. Do you really want to go talk in Camelot? Right now? I'm willing to try, if it's that important. Especially if it's about what you said in the swamp. We do need to talk about that. Do you want to go? 7 shades of plots and plans tilted her head the other way. Do you? I huffed softly, then stomped over to the door of the workshop and leaned out into the kitchen. I angled my voice toward the front room and the stairs beyond, then called out, Sevens and I are going to Camelot for a few minutes. A reply floated down the stairs a few moments later, in Preem's bell-like voice. Take shoes, she intoned. I blushed in embarrassment. Yes, of course, it wouldn't do to forget shoes a second time in 3 days, even if I was planning firmly against getting whisked off into another outside escapade for hours on end, shoeless and stranded and carrying nothing but a damp bath towel. I stomped into the front room, muttering things like, "This is going to be a quick trip, it is," and, "Sevens, you best not be planning any nonsense, or I am going to be very upset indeed." After stamping into my shoes, I spotted Preem at the top of the stairs. She was looking down at me, hands folded before her. "We won't be long," I said, and made it sound like an apology. I took the damp towel off my shoulder and moved to drape it over the banister. "And I'll put that away when we're back, sorry. Let Lozzie know, please." "Keep the towel," said Preem. Why?" "Great practical value," she said, then turned on her heel and clicked back into the upstairs corridor on some unknown errand. I huffed and grumbled. Why was everybody being so cryptic today? Was Rain going to come home and make me guess how Badger was doing? If Evie woke up now, would she ask me to solve a riddle? Perhaps Sheng might encourage me to divine her mood from the splayed guts of a half-eaten pigeon. When I rejoined Sevens in the magical workshop, she had summoned her own shoes directly onto her feet, a pair of sensible black flats. Her umbrella was in her hand too, poised at a jaunty angle, like a young princess prepared for her mid-afternoon stroll in the gardens of her father's estate. Suddenly I had a terrible, paranoid thought that she was actually about to whisk me off to meet her father again, for some reason I didn't quite comprehend. But the impression faded as quickly as it had struck me. This was still Sevens. I still trusted her. She extended her free hand toward me. "Ready, Your Grace." "I thought you'd dropped that," I snapped. I tooted and scowled at her, while scooping my squid skull mask off the table. I wasn't going outside again without the mask, ever. "Dropped what, Your Grace?" I didn't deign to reply. I took Sevens' hand in mine, then wrapped the tip of a tentacle around her wrist for good measure, glaring at her the whole time. "I suppose I don't have to tell you to hold on tight," I said. "Are you actually coming with me, or going your own way?" "I walk beside you, my queen." I rolled my eyes hard enough to hurt a little, clenched my stomach muscles, and plunged my mind into the black depths of my own soul. To think that such a thing would ever become simple routine. Out we went, the princess and I. Camelot was still as beautiful as the very first time I'd seen it, in that first ever dream I'd shared with Lozzie. Sometimes I wondered if Lozzie had chosen Camelot on purpose, or if it really was just a coincidence. A non-threatening, safe, quiet place, where things had happened once but were now long past. At the time, she'd just intercepted the message from Maisie, intended for me, but even with that she couldn't possibly have known my primordial terror of outside, of these unknown and alien places which had haunted me in dreams, across the membrane between worlds, dragging me back again and again for lost hours in dripping black jungles and windowless metal hallways and vast places that made teenage Heather curl up in a ball and sob herself into unconsciousness. In contrast, Lozzie had picked somewhere lovely. It was the right choice, the first taste I'd ever had of outside as somewhere not to fear. Even now, with a castle-building site all around us, it was beautiful. The nights worked without any of the modern blights of such processes: jackhammers, drills, the clank of machinery, the stink of hydrocarbons, all were absent. The loudest noise was the click-clack cutting of bricks from the huge blocks of stone. There was no pollution here, not unless the slow-crawling caterpillars on the horizon put out some hidden, invisible, odorless waste product. I doubted that, somehow. Lozzie would not have made them that way. The castle didn't look very different compared with 2 days earlier. The keep walls were a little higher, perhaps there was a second internal floor in place now, but the exterior curtain wall was still all but a mere outline. On the far side of the keep I spotted a section where the knights had started putting those massive stone blocks on top of each other, beginning the real wall. 3 caterpillars were gathered around that spot, perhaps just having delivered the done, sandy blocks to the seat of a wall, but they were currently just hanging out there, not doing anything. 2 of them had long tendrils of strange sticky black tar extending from their faces, wrapped around the stone blocks as if helping to settle them in place, or perhaps glue them together in lieu of mortar. Sevens waited politely while I recovered from the aftermath of the slip, panting and squeezing my eyes shut as I forced myself not to vomit. She even kept her arm out for me, a support for my tentacles to cling to, like a squid attached to a piece of elegant, shapely driftwood. Eventually I straightened up and gazed out across the castle building site. Knights moved about their tasks, setting bricks in place, mixing mortar, cutting blocks. Some were currently carving out a pathway between the castle and one of the future gatehouses, pulling up the turf so others could start laying brickwork directly into the ground. I'd landed us on that same hillside where we always arrived, the taller hill that would eventually be encircled and protected inside the future line of the curtain walls. In a real medieval castle, it would have been the perfect place to site some kind of watchtower, or perhaps a siege engine. For now it was still home to the desiccated corpse of the unnamed young man who had died out in the swamp. 2 knights still stood vigil, by his head and his feet, but the forest knight was nowhere to be seen. I'd landed us at a respectful distance from the hilltop itself, just beyond human earshot. All was bathed in the purple light of Camelot's alien sky. I felt it on my skin, a soothing darkness from the glittering firmament. "Well, here we are," I said, sniffing back a nosebleed from the brain math. I fumbled with the damp towel, about to ruin it by wiping my bloody nose all over the fabric. Preem was right, towels were very useful things. But then Sevens produced a linen handkerchief seemingly out of nowhere and offered it to me. It was white, not yellow. "Use this, Your Grace," she said. I tooted at her calling me that yet again, but I accepted the handkerchief all the same, and used it to wipe the blood off my face. The nosebleed didn't last very long, just long enough for me to sniff and splutter a bit before it stopped. I folded the handkerchief and gestured awkwardly. "Thank you," I said. "I'll wash this and return it." "Is this a real object or?" "You know what, don't answer that. The less I understand about how outside works, the better." But Sevens held out her hand for the handkerchief. "Please, Your Grace. You wouldn't deprive your wife-to-be of a holy relic, would you?" My guts froze. "Holy relic? Stained with her blood," said Sevens. I could hear the capital H in her. She meant me. I sighed with enough force to light a fire, then stepped back in mingled disgust and embarrassed irritation. "Sevens, really?" I held the handkerchief awkwardly in one hand for a moment, then stuffed it in the pocket of my pajama bottoms and crossed my arms. "Well, now I'm absolutely not giving it back to you. This isn't funny anymore. Stop it. Do you find something funny about this?" Turquoise eyes bored back into mine. Ice cold, unreadable, and not happy with me. A lump grew in my throat, but I had no idea what was going on. More importantly, I was the one who should have been irritated. I was irritated. I was angry and still upset, and I didn't understand why she was trying so hard to derail this conversation. "What game are you playing now, Sevens?" What's next? Are you going to turn into 3 of my friends in sequence and use their voices to convince me to do something I shouldn't?" Sevens blinked. "A low blow, kitten." I flushed with sudden shame, mortified, mouth hanging open. Then I hiccuped, hard and painful in my throat. No, Sevens, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. You didn't deserve that. That was deeply uncalled for. I apologize." "Apology accepted." I sighed and squeezed my eyes shut for a moment. I could feel a stress headache threatening at the sides of my skull. "Sevens, whatever you're doing, it's hurting me. I don't understand what this is about, if it's a joke or something else, calling me a queen, or a messiah, or worse. It's like you're slipping back into old habits, trying to make me understand something through demonstration rather than bloody well talking to me." I hiccuped again. "I'm sorry, pardon my bad language." Sevens just stared. For the first time ever, I felt a distinct sense that the yellow princess was being forced to think something over before replying. Then, eventually, she said, "You are not the only one who is angry right now." I blinked in surprise. My damp hair suddenly felt very cold. "You're angry with me?" Sevens. 7 shades of sunlight produced another object in her free hand, apparently from nowhere, a Japanese-style folding fan, dyed in the thick, treacly yellow of melting butter on fresh bread. She flicked it open and hid the bottom half of her face, leaving only her eyes visible. "Yes," was all she said. Then she left me waiting. Sevens, is this about how we've been using you?" "No, how I've been using you." I felt an awful churn in my stomach. "I'm so sorry. I mean, when you tagged along to Hringe-Windla, I just treated you like a helper, despite what you're going through yourself. I know you're trying to find a new way to define yourself, and I thought I was giving you time and space. And then when you helped with Natalie, I thank you for that, thank you, but I don't mean to take you for granted. And about our engagement, I'm not going to leave you hanging forever and 7 shades of silent study did exactly that. She spooled out rope for me to hang myself. I trailed off. "I am searching for purpose," she said eventually, mouth muffled behind the fan. "For a new shape in which to fit. Your family they are is giving me spaces in which to fit myself. You give me purposes alongside you. The process is ongoing. Do not apologize for the greatest gift you have given me." "Oh, you do not understand why I am angry." I shook my head. "No. Because you keep putting it in riddles. And you keep rejecting the role you filled with such relish. Queen, Messiah, Avatar, Goddess." I sighed a great sigh and barely resisted the urge to roll my eyes. "Is this because I turned you down in the swamp? Is that what you're mad about? Sevens, you were trying to make me act like an actual god in front of 2 terrified people, not to even mention a whole bunch of very impressionable shamblers. I wasn't about to deceive them in that kind of way. I'm not going to act like a cult leader or a monarch and take advantage of people or—" The folding fan snapped shut. Sevens was revealed once again. "You were not acting. You were being. And then you lied to yourself. Excuse me. You are continuing to lie to yourself." Sevens blinked, slowly and almost difficult. "I am not made for this. Understand that much, please. I am still not made for intervention. This very conversation is an act of self-redefinition, but if I do not have this conversation, then I will turn into something I will not like, which will end poorly for both of us." Sevens. It's okay, you don't have to force yourself. You reject the role of leader, of queen, of monarch, of idol, of goddess, yet 2 days ago you used the prerogative of that role all the same. You took the power and applied it, yet rejected the responsibilities. I didn't whisper temptation in your ear to make you cruel mistress of the fate of others. I did it to make you see what act you were committing." I squinted at Sevens, having trouble keeping up. "I'm really sorry, but I don't follow." "What act?" "Torture." My mouth opened on a reflex I had never examined, let alone anticipated. Even as the words fell from my lips, they tasted like rot. I had to. Sevens, I had to. I had no choice. Did you now? Of course I had to. We had no time. Natalie's parents had to be made to understand, to be broken, quickly. You know that. Something horrible and barbed and sick stirred in my chest. There were always other options. Bad ones. I said. Panic shook my limbs. The thing in my chest sprouted spikes, burrowed into my heart and lungs, but I was feeding it, flash growing the thing with every word I spoke. Bad for Natalie. Sevens, you didn't complain at the time. You didn't protest. Nobody did. Well, I suppose Evelyn did, a little bit, but everybody saw the necessity. We had to do it. We had to. Are you trying to tell me I was wrong? With a flicker like the iris of an antique camera shutter, the yellow princess vanished. Evelyn Say stood before me. Shoulders wrapped in a shawl over pajamas, leaning on her walking stick, scowling with deep yellow eyes the color of boiled butter. I flinched in surprise, though I knew it was just Sevens, wearing Evie's face. Sevens. Don't do that, don't we're my friends, it's. Sevens, I know Evie would do that, yes. My stomach was turning over. The black mass in my chest was trying to crawl up my throat, like a physical thing I'd gestated inside my flesh. You don't have to remind me. But I would choose to do it, said the yellow mage. Make no mistake about that. My hands are never forced. But my hands quivered. In an effort to stop shaking, I hugged two of my tentacles to my chest, holding on tight. Sevens, stop speaking with her voice, stop it. Stop it. Sevens obeyed my snapped order without complaint. 7 shades of Say vanished with a blink only to be replaced by Rain. Sevens. I squealed. I'm better than I used to be, you know. Seven said with Rain's voice, easy and relaxed, almost laughing. At saying no to you, at being me, for myself. I got you to thank for that, Heather. No question about it. I swallowed and tried to control myself, feeling like I was going to be sick. Sevens, where is this going? I demanded. Is this supposed to be you, speaking with Rain's voice, or Rain herself? Or your idea of Rain? You can't know what everybody was thinking. All I could do was stare, open-mouthed. I felt like a slug was trying to crawl up my throat. Rain shot a finger gun and a wink at me. Love you. No, I murmured, my voice breaking. No, Rain would have said something, Rain would have spoken up, Rain would have stopped me, if she thought it was wrong. Would she, really? I shook my head. Stop. Stop, please. But it wasn't over yet. Sevens wasn't finished with me. Rain flickered out like a snuffed candle. In her place stood Lozzie, with the usual pink and blue and white of her flag poncho replaced by 3 different shades of yellow. Perhaps Sevens was trying to soften the blow by making it clear that these were masks, not people. 7 shades of silly Pixie giggled, exactly like Lozzie. Outside isn't scary, she chirped, flapping her poncho like an excited squirrel. I didn't even see it that way. And they understood in the end, right? You were nice to them in the end, right? So it's all okay. Lozzie, no, Lozzie wouldn't do something so cruel. She wouldn't. And I don't want to think about it. Lozzie's bouncy energy trailed off into an awkward, somber-faced little smile. People should stop being afraid of it out here. I don't care what they think. Oh, Lozzie. I bit my lip and felt the threat of tears fill my eyes. I almost reached out to her, though I knew it was just Sevens. But then she was gone, a wisp on the wind, blowing away like golden wheat chaff across the hillsides. My hand closed on somebody else. Zheng, a mountain of muscle towering over me, my hand holding her wrist. Yellow eyes filled what should have been a sharp and predatory gaze. A maw of sharp teeth opened wide in a razor-sharp grin of savage joy. A tiger in the jungle deeps, leering at her prey. 7 shades of far too large and far too close leaned over me, leaned in close, rumbling like a furnace. Sevens, I know it's just you, it's not. The yellow demon leaned in so close that I could feel the heat of her skin beating against my face. Torture, shaman, she purred. If you had asked me to, I would have eaten those monkeys alive for you. In front of their pup. I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. Zheng, no, if I asked that, you would have to tell me I was wrong. You are right, shaman. You see further. You see everything. You freed me, you gave me new life. So I believe, in you. And then she was gone. I was left standing there in shock, on a Camelot hillside beneath the purple whorled skies, with 7 shades of 7 faces standing at a polite distance from me, her umbrella tipped down against the ground, held at a jaunty angle. "No," I murmured. "You made a choice to inflict pain, to get your way. Nobody forced you to do that. None really tried to argue with you." I shook my head. My throat was closing up, trying to keep the vile thing trapped in my chest. My words came out in a quiver. I hugged myself with 3 more tentacles, wrapping them around myself. But I had to. Sevens tilted her head, cold and unreadable as ever. She offered me no solace. "Stop lying to yourself. What other choice did I have?" "Plenty of choices. There were other ways, Your Grace. Other methods you could have attempted, before torture. You could have exposed Natalie's parents to Tenny, first. You could have shown them Twill, in full wolfish mantle. You could have taken them to Camelot first, reunited them with their daughter first, rather than putting them through the unknown ordeal. You could have done those things, but you chose not to. It might not have worked. Sevens, you know that, you know it might not have worked. They might have rejected it, not believed, their minds might not have broken properly. Might. I shook my head, harder and harder, like a nervous tick I couldn't control. My breath came out in little pants and hiccups. What are you saying, Sevens? What is this? Natalie is not you. She does not share the curses and blessings of your situation. She will never see spirits. She did not lose a sister or a twin. She will not be haunted by the eye. You could have left her with a story for her parents. She would still have grown up safe. My temper suddenly snapped, hot and red. She might not have. I yelled in Seven's face. The rotten, twisted thing inside my chest finally exploded onto the surface, a thing that had festered in a wound for a long, long decade. I let it out, I gave it free rein, I listened to that impulse, wallowing in my own self-pity. My voice rose into a barely human hiss-scratch of self-disgust and justified rage, echoing out across the quiet plain of Camelot. Down in the building site at the foot of the shallow incline, the knights paused in their work, tools going still and bricks suspended mid-placement, to gaze up at their queen's anger. Insult me, fine. Call me a monster, whatever. I don't care. But don't insinuate I should have left that girl behind. 7 shades of stoic and stolid didn't even blink. My tantrum did not impress. You could have left her with a story for her parents, she repeated. What part of that implies leaving her behind? Sevens nodded, as if conceding a point. But I didn't feel like I was winning, I felt filthy. And you judged that was worth the torture of 2 human beings. You don't agree? Then you should have said something, shouldn't you? My agreement doesn't matter. Maybe I also believe it was the right thing. But you are avoiding the point, Your Grace. You made a choice, and then you denied those people the relief they needed, by refusing to accept your role. I'm not going to pretend to be a god. I huffed, shaking my head, but I was barely convincing myself. Exposed to the purple light of Camelot, the dripping black rotten thing from inside my chest was cracking and withering. Then accept you made a choice. You made a choice to inflict pain. It's that, or the royal prerogative. The will of the queen, inscribed on flesh and nerve and in the blood of the subject, as would be your right, if you reach out and grasp it. I don't want that. Stop calling me that. Then accept you made a choice to torture. I opened my mouth to protest again, but I realized we'd gone in a circle. Tears filled my eyes. I felt a sob tugging at my throat. I bit my lip, tried to force that down. I was right, I knew I'd done the right thing. But if it wasn't necessary, then I. Sevens waited politely, offering not the merest shred of comfort. I blinked furiously, trying not to cry. She was right. It had been so hard to see during the heat of the moment, the burning need to avoid another child going through what I did. I was trying to be aware, I said, struggling over each word. My voice was so much more human again, but I couldn't meet Seven's eyes. I stared at the grass, panting softly, trying to hold on to that justification. I know I was projecting my own parents onto them, Stephen and Isabella. I knew I had to resist vindictive pleasure, and I did. I did. I looked up at Sevens, embarrassed by my own desperate need for forgiveness and validation, but she just stared back at me. I didn't enjoy hurting them. I didn't make it about me. Or at least I tried not to. Ah, said Sevens. I see. So, you didn't enjoy it. That makes it all better then. Perhaps it even hurt you more than it hurt them? No. I cried out. No, that's not what I mean. I don't mean I didn't mean to. The final collapse of my excuses came quick and cold, stealing over me like morning frost over dead grass. The rotten thing from within me froze and died. All my anger and embarrassment turned to slurry in my hands. Oh, I murmured. No. No, I didn't think about I made a choice. There were other options, they wouldn't have been as certain, but oh no. I sniffed back the threat of tears, then put my face in one hand and tried not to sit down in a heap. Hugging myself with my tentacles, shaking with each breath, struggling to resist the urge to hide inside my squid skull mask. I chose to hurt them. I chose to do that. You're right, there were other ways. There were. Sevens didn't speak. I screwed my eyes shut and gritted my teeth. I'm becoming a monster, aren't I? I whined through my teeth. I am. This isn't even the first time I've tortured a person. Just the first innocent ones. You're right. I chose this, I chose to do it, My father understands the uses of cruelty, said the Yellow Princess. He is intimately familiar with the application and purposes of pain. As I cried quiet, bitter tears into my own hand, scrubbing them away with my sleeve, Seven's voice held less of its former ice. She spoke as what she was a storyteller, making a didactic point, but without the barbs of ironic satire. In my father's case, Sevens continued, beyond the wall of my self-indulgent tears, he applies pain and cruelty with the right of a king. He never asks himself if it is right or wrong to do so, it is merely his nature, the nature of a king, expressed upon the flesh of his subjects. In the case of a human being, cruelty is the product of domination, exploitation, or hate. But you straddle the line between human and divine. If you were to grasp that side of your nature, I could not argue with your intent. Your methods would be cruel, but they would be in accordance with what you are. But you refuse that, so you are hurting yourself with lies. I nodded to myself, crying quietly. What was I becoming? Sevens let out a small sigh, a very controlled sound. But I am glad you did not choose that. I do not know if I could continue to love an engine of divine intent. Too much like my father. Too much like what I was trying to imitate, born into the application of cruelty as my prerogative. I am glad you chose otherwise, Heather. But I still did it, I whined. I still chose. Sevens crossed the gap between us with 3 neat steps, and drew me into a sudden embrace. She hugged me tight and wrapped something warm and soft about my shoulders, tucking it close around my neck and lifting a corner to help dry my eyes. It was her yellow mantle, the engagement gift, the piece of her which was now mine. I let out a hopeless little laugh sob and gently pushed her away, though without any real strength in my arm. No, I murmured. No, I don't deserve to be comforted over this. I sniffed hard and wiped my eyes, forcing myself upright. I don't deserve to be feeling sorry for myself. Not me. I wasn't the victim, I was the torturer. Even if it was worth it. Was it worth it? Sevens shrugged minutely. I cannot say. That is up to you to decide. Thought so, I grunted. To my great surprise, Sevens suddenly smiled. Her smile was a sharp and shrewd thing, unlike any expression I'd ever seen before. The yellow princess smiled like a cross between a weasel and a fox, subtle and cunning. I do love you, kitten. I'm glad to have you back. We're not done yet, I said. I shook my head, hard and curt. No, that's not what I mean. How do I stop this happening again? Sevens blinked. I went on. Obviously I have a propensity for this. The potential is in me. I don't like it, but pretending it's not there, that would run the risk of something like this happening again. Maybe I wouldn't do anything differently, maybe with Natalie it really was the right choice, but it was a choice. What do I do? Acknowledge it, suggested Sevens, tilting her head slightly to one side. She actually sounded uncertain. I'd never heard this mask talk this way before. She obviously hadn't gotten this far, hadn't made that final leap. Her script ran out here. Talk about it. Figure out why you did it. Commit to not doing it again. I know exactly why I did it. My voice shook with hot shame, but I drew myself up and pulled Seven's yellow gift close around my shivering body. I wasn't cold, in fact I was sweating, but I was still shivering. I drew my tentacles inside it too, but kept my squid skull mask in both hands now, staring into the black and empty eye sockets. I did it because I was projecting my own parents onto them. I've been ignoring that. No longer, though. There was a voice, in my head. I pulled a face and sighed. Not a literal voice, I'm not having auditory hallucinations. Maybe it was in my chest, not my head. I rubbed at my sternum with one of my own tentacles. A bitter voice, a vindictive version of me. I wanted to hurt them. I wanted to really, really hurt them. Ah. I didn't, though. I didn't do the things it wanted me to do. But, maybe I was being cruel anyway. Maybe I was hurting my own mum and dad, by proxy. Must I ask why? I let out a tiny, sad laugh, and raised my eyes from the unseeing sockets of my real face, to look up at the purple, crystalline whirls which filled the sky, like tattered royal cloaks brushing the atmosphere with strands of transcendent fabric. Going to university here in Sherrowford, the entire decision to go in the first place, I think it was about getting away from my parents. I could have gotten into the University of Reading, it's got a perfectly fine literature department. But I've never told anybody this. I lied to my parents. I told them I applied to Reading, that I was thinking of going to university close to home, so I could stay at home while studying. But I never applied, not really. I lied to them. To get away. You don't hate them. A statement, not a question. I shook my head. I don't, no. My voice broke, went quiet and soft. I can't hate them or blame them, it wasn't their fault, not really. It was the I. My parents didn't know any of this was real. They didn't know Maisie was real. They didn't know or understand what they did to me. When I left home for university in Sherrowford, I didn't think it was real either, but I had to get away from them. I had to get away from that house. From them, from the threat of hospital again. I swallowed hard, thick with mucus and tears, but I didn't start crying. Quite, Seven said, as if I might stop there. Not that they would actually have ever sent me back, I said. But the memories were there, wrapped up in that house. And now I know, all of it was real, they forced me to try to forget her, to forget Maisie, pretend she wasn't real. None of it ever happened, Heather. You're imagining things again, Heather. Focus on the physical things in front of you, Heather. I found I was gritting my teeth, doing a terrible imitation of my mother's voice. I had to force myself to relax, taking several deep breaths. Maybe I do hate them. It's not their fault. But I still do. I admit it. And so maybe I wanted to hurt them. I took a great shuddering breath and lowered my eyes from the sky, ripping myself out of my memories and back down to Camelot. I felt like I'd just stepped out of a cold shower, shivering and freezing, naked and vulnerable, but scoured clean, wounds opened and sluiced with fresh water, dead flesh cut away, pathogens killed, bleeding freely from an old injury, but bleeding clean, fresh, red blood at long last. It's why I never really miss them, I murmured. I wiped my eyes on my sleeve again. The rescue operation for Maisie, that's not why I don't talk to my parents. I never really miss that house. I don't call much, I don't like to talk to them. It's not their fault, no, but I do hate them a bit. Sevens nodded gently, a golden smudge in my peripheral vision, glowing like sunset on seawater. I've been off balance since the moment I saw Natalie, I said. I saw myself in her, and that was that. And I made a choice to torture two people. Maybe it was right, maybe it was wrong. But you're correct, Sevens, it was a choice. I made it. I sighed and looked back down at the squid skull mask. I need to be so very careful. This is one of the reasons I love you. I looked up at Sevens in her ice-cold face, unreadable expression, and turquoise eyes. Ah. Your capacity for stepping off the path. I gave a sad little laugh. If you say so. I wouldn't have realized a thing without you prodding me. How are you so good at this, Sevens? Seven Shades of Modest Triumph shrugged. I've helped a lot of young women. But never one I was in love with myself. This was messy, dirty, quick, and risky. And I was angry with you. Still, I said. Thank you for confronting me. Sevens tilted her head slightly, neither a shake nor a nod. May I have my handkerchief back now? Oh, I pulled the blood-soiled handkerchief out of my pocket and pulled a face. I suppose so. As long as you aren't going to treat it as an actual holy relic. Even if my blood does have unique properties. It would only be fair turnabout for you collecting pieces of me. Excuse me. Don't think I've forgotten the scrap of yellow you kept, from our first meeting. The scrap of fabric. I blushed and grimaced. Oh, I mean, that was a mistake. It wasn't meant to be weird. I think. Sevens held out one hand. Then returned the favor. I rolled my eyes, but at least she wasn't trying to call me by a royal title anymore. I handed her the scrap of fabric and blood. Sevens made it vanish somehow, into a pocket on her pocket-free skirt. Thank you, kitten. I shook my head, exasperated but relieved. I looked away from Sevens, out across Camelot, across the castle still taking shape. Is that why you wanted to talk to me out here? To show me physical proof of what I was pretending to be? Or not pretending to be, rather. Guwuruik, went Sevens the blood goblin. I turned back to her in surprise. The yellow princess was gone, replaced with the scrawny, pale, lank-haired figure of the vampire, 7 shades of sanguine pretender, dressed in black tank top, matching shorts, and a pair of black trainers on the end of spindly legs. She rolled a bony shrug and gurgled at me. Guess so. Sevens. I said with delight. Are you better? I mean, does this mean you're not angry now? Yeah. Sevens closed the gap between us and bumped her head against my side, like a huge cat. She smelled faintly of grass cuttings, for some odd reason. I wrapped a tentacle around her shoulders and she leaned on me, hot and wriggly against my side. Well, thank you, I said. Wanna go look at your castle? She asked, blinking those huge black and red eyes down at the building site. Not yet. It would be unfair of me to interrupt their first draft, as it were. I should show them some respect, wait until they're done, not go waltzing about like I own the place. Even if I do own the place, it's not polite. Good Queen Morel, Sevens croaked, then cackled like a broken engine. Don't start that up again. I tooted, then gently grabbed the back of her head with another tentacle. Sevens let out a little squeak of surprise. It really does make me uncomfortable. Sorry, went Sevens, with a face that was anything but sorry. But how can I resist? You have a castle, in a place called Camelot. It's perfect. It's absurd, I sighed. That's what it is. Heather Pendragon Morel. TCH. Really, you don't like Lavinia much, right? Well, only because people have misused the name. I don't mind it on its own. Pendragon. No. Arthuria. Also no. Sevens. I ruffled her hair with one hand, messing it up and making her squeak and whine, but I quickly relented. She writhed and grumbled and settled against my side again, black hair all messed up, then eventually looked over her shoulder, back up the hill. Puyalurk. What about him? She asked. Gonna take a looky look inside? I twisted to look over my own shoulder, following Seven's gaze, though I didn't really need to. I knew exactly who and what she was looking at. Inside? I asked. Not literally. Oh, come on then. With Sevens wrapped around a tentacle, and a tentacle wrapped around Sevens, we plodded up to the top of the hill, to have another gander at the mystery corpse who had carried an outsider coin in his pockets. The knights were still standing their vigil, out of respect or tradition or some other meaning that I'd accidentally gifted to them via my own mind. I nodded to them in greeting, or as a gesture of mutual respect, but both of them just stared straight ahead at the horizon. Seven stared down at the corpse, making soft thinky noises as she turned her head to the left and right. I joined her, but there was nothing new to see. So, gonna look inside him? She asked eventually. You mean with brain math? Well yeah. I don't want to, I said. Then I sighed and rubbed a hand over my face. I felt like I needed another shower already. I wiped my face on the still damp towel instead. That's another thing I've been ignoring on purpose. I don't really want to use brain math to define somebody who's already dead. I don't want to look at a corpse through the lens of hyperdimensional mathematics. Sevens twisted her head at me. Why? It's a corpse. You might find out how he got the coin, right? Maybe. Maybe not. I had to push past a very specific reluctance, in the back of my mind. Back when I defined Sarika, to pull her from the eye, I learned all these weird little details about her past, all the things she'd ever done or thought or felt. Those details didn't stay clear in my mind, once it was over. Like I saw all of her at once, but then I forgot most of it again. Sort of like a dream. Sevens croaked. But this dead man, he's just meat. Dry meat. If I define the corpse, what if it's no different to a living person? What if it's just meat? What if I can see a whole personal history, in meat? What if I can see the value, or set of values, or piece of mathematics which defines dead or alive? What if I could bring him back, just by switching a few numbers? Sevens bit her lip, and didn't answer. I said it for the both of us. Because that really would be a godlike act. So, I would rather not look. Not yet. Sevens grunted. I could hear her chewing on her lip, but she didn't say anything more. I took a deep breath and let out a long sigh, then looked up from the corpse. Besides, there's got to be other ways to find out why he had that coin. I could look at the coin itself, or I could try. With a flutterpuff of poncho flounce, Lozzie materialized about 5 feet to our left, standing with arms wide and 1 foot raised, as if in the middle of a ballet move. Heathy. Lozzie. My heart climbed into my mouth. What's going on? Nothing's okay. No, you're smiling. Sorry, I just right. Is everything okay? And Sevi. Lozzie chirped. Mrumruck, went Sevens, peering around my side. Lozzie, nothing is going on, yes? Rain called. Lozzie said. She lowered her arms and one leg, then pointed with a poncho flourish, at the dead man lying on the ground. Remember I took a picture, on my cellular phone? Guess who recognized him? Go on, guess. A sinking feeling dragged at the pit of my stomach. Badger, I said. Badger recognized the dead man. Badger. Correct. Rourke, Sevens gurgled. Badger. HRRMM.